for a parking problem.
And 4 in your 23.
Yeah, that's 4, I'll get a 28. Come on, truck when you're ready.
Go ahead.
Line truck, white Lincoln X-ray 985, should come back up next.
So you had 2000. Patrick Spalding.
10-4. I think it's from note in the, something like that. I might not be leaving a note on a vehicle, so I think I'm going to remove it.
Rockingham 505. 505 enter vandalism case for Athens. Complainant, soon to be ex, slashed her tires and has made threatening comments to her. She's concerned he might return.
Yeah, forgive this at 32.
10-4. You're assigned to a vandalism case in Athens. Did you copy the 505?
Yeah, 4. Look at that.
21.
No, 3 in Depot Street. Truck boy entering 5.
7435.
10-4.
10-4.
Can you go 643 again?
143.
You go with that 43 you had. I didn't hear any, but I had just looks like we do.
10-4. I just wanted to know if you should be put back 76 to Cabana Circle or to the subject's address.
Yeah, I'll be 23 back on that town property case, and I'll be 76 to the Williams Road address to see if I can find the owner.
10-4. 449 1120.
Now 449 1121, thank you.
10-4.
Code 4. 4.
Rockingham 535.
You have a great college.
535.
Should be. Got no number of women who fucked into a house. I'll slide up that way.
Caller is now been able to close the front door. She's now pounding on the door, trying to get in still. No flight floor on her here. Not tight shirt on. And number 21
We have separation. Inboard now. She's ready. Hey, everybody. Happy Saturday. Good to see you. I'm not going to say Merry Christmas yet because I have the feeling we'll do a show before Christmas. I also want to invite you to join me in a little while for a beer. Yes, I do have a beer tonight. This is a Carlsberg Pilsner. It's a pint-sized can. I'm looking forward to it. But I'm going to hold off opening it until, I don't know, maybe 8:30 or 9:30. So that gives you guys time to plan to get yourself a drink, and we'll all get one together. Since it is time for the holidays, right? Let's have this will be our Christmas party, I guess, something like that. All right. So we got a few things to go over tonight, some interesting stuff. And I want to start just by addressing Kristen, a new person in chat. She says it's her first time on the channel. She is on the fence and had heard this might be a place to go. You are absolutely right, Kristen. Look, just a little idea about me, but I think most people here are probably in the same situation as me. I began covering this case when Turtle Boy broke this story on April 17th of 2023. And when he broke this story, he put out what was clear to me at the time was an intact defense theory. It wasn't like it was a result of him having his own Boston Globe spotlight team to go out and investigate this. Nothing wrong with that, but it was clear we were getting something that was from a defense team. That didn't mean it was wrong. And there was a lot of stuff in it that I found to be very interesting. So, and it was a journey too. Let's call it a journey because I am not someone that has any experience with law enforcement other than my many years as a bar owner. I worked with a lot of police, and that was a great experience. But in terms of what goes on, detective work, solving cases, knew nothing about it. I had done my share of reading up on following other true crime cases, but that still doesn't mean that I knew anything. I was ignorant about things like medical examinations, autopsies, forensic data, things like that. I mean, I knew nothing, right? So there was a lot to learn, and it's a journey on trying to learn how things were done. But I do think that that's something that our citizens should take, not only for our own benefit to try to learn things, but let's be honest. The police and the prosecution in these cases, though would in one sense we can't judge them because they have professional knowledge that we don't have. But in another sense, we see an awful lot of mistakes. Senator Birchmore, we're going to go over Senator Birchmore tonight. Really good article by the Boston Globe that shed some new light on a lot of how that investigation materialized. And we have a right in the public to look at this and say there are a lot of things that aren't done well. And also look at the Karen Reed case. The prosecution ended up with a mountain of very convincing evidence, but they couldn't put it together in a convincing way. And so they were not able to get a verdict out of the jury. Now, that's a problem. So I think and they made mistakes that I, over a year ago, would sit here and say I know nothing about this shit, but this is not the way to do it. And I could have taken the position, and many of you are the same thing, said, well, what's the point of, we don't have the expertise. We shouldn't even comment on it. But yet, I was right. Many of us were right. They were wrong. They had the wrong strategy. That's proven now. That proof is in the pudding. So, Kristen, I believe that your position of being on the fence is the right position for anybody to be in any case until all of the questions are answered to your satisfaction. That's the way you should be. That's where I began on this case. I started out leaning towards conspiracy because, again, I was ignorant about a lot of things, such as forensic data. And we looked at things like, for instance, the 227 search. There was an extraction of Jen McCabe's phone, one of the people in the house that reported, according to that extraction, that she had searched at 2:27 a.m. for how long to die in the cold. Now, for me, there was no innocent explanation for that if that was true. Now, we now know that it's not true, but you need to go down that journey on your own. And part of that journey involves a lot of self-reflection, looking deep inside yourself. We all bring a lot of biases and assumptions to a case or to any investigation or anything that we're looking into. And you have to look in the mirror every day to try to say, have I taken into account for any assumptions that I have, for instance, or biases. An example of bias would be you might be biased against the police. You think, the police are always corrupt. Well, if that's what you think, I don't mean to disrespect that. Like, if you've had that experience in life, that's part of your experience, and that's important. But nothing is black and white in the world. And so you can maybe make the leap that, yes, there is corruption, but obviously there are tens of thousands of police officers that are just doing their job. It would be chaos if you couldn't trust any of the police. And that's logically, it's just not the kind of system we have. So you don't give the police the benefit of the doubt. Corruption occurs, mistakes occur. But at the same time, you shouldn't start out with an assumption that all police are bad and this looks fishy and stuff like that. So just be very careful about looking at all of the evidence. You're going to get the impression, if you listen to this, or maybe you've heard this, that I am not on the fence. And that's true. At this point, I'm not. But I was on the fence for months. And I just kept asking questions. And at the time that I was on the fence, at least publicly in terms of YouTube and social media, pretty much nobody else was on the fence or asking questions. So it was very, very hard. And I'm sure a lot of people here in chat, our regulars, quietly on their own had those same questions and were looking for a place to go where it just wasn't all 100%. The other, on the Free Karen Reed side, they don't ask any questions. It's 100%. There's a conspiracy, and it's been that, and they've covered it that way since day one. And the reason they cover it that way is not because they're idiots. It's because there's a public thirst for conspiracy theory. An ordinary hit and run in this case is not very interesting. But a conspiracy theory where police and prosecutors are involved with planting and manufacturing evidence, that's really interesting. And they understood this. So people like Turtle Boy, LTL, the Grifter, Young Jelly, these guys, they all covered it that way. They never asked a question. And if evidence comes out during the course of this case that contradicts that conspiracy theory, they don't even report it to their audience. So those people following those channels, they really do live in a bubble. So I appreciate that you've come here, Kristen. And I always give out my email. So I'll post it here. I always entertain questions or people that have disagreements, different opinions to me. As long as we have civil and polite discussion, I always welcome it. So leedskev at gmail.com. So you are always welcome here, even if you have completely different views than us, as long as you do two things, I would say. One, be respectful, obviously, to everybody in chat. Even if things get heated, try to dial it back, try to be respectful. But two, you really need to you have to be sure that it's the truth that you're after. And I'm sure that you are, Kristen, because you're here, because of the way but there are people that come here that really aren't open to the truth. They have a conclusion about this case, and all they want to do is argue to that conclusion. They want to cram every fact into that. They a lot of times end up with just plain inaccurate views of things that happen in this case over and over again. All right. So, for instance, I had a question today from somebody, very respectful, someone who does not tend to believe in the conspiracy because they think it's too complicated. However, they have questions about things. They wondered if a taillight could break from a part of the body, whether it's the head or the elbow or whatever, because to them, a taillight was an extremely hard piece of plastic. Now, they're right. And those are legitimate questions that all of us have asked, right? So I want to show you a quick video that Colin Forrester was kind enough to provide.
Want to learn how to make your tail lights clear? Just
clear.
smash them in.
Guess I can't, but
Want to learn how to make
this
your
will
tail
repeat. So
lights
watch it a
clear?
couple of times. Watch how you have to look
Just
closely, but see
smash 'em in.
on the second below here, it smashes that piece right off.
Want to learn how to make
Now, this
your
is a
tail
pretty
lights
thin
clear?
board. That's not like it's
Just
not like he's
smash
using a
'em.
2x4. That's a kind of a flimsy
Want to
piece
learn
of wood
how
board.
to make your tail lights
And with two
clear?
hits, he's able to smash that
Just
off.
smash 'em in.
So now that's not scientific, but that does show that, these things break off if they're struck in the right way. Now, Karen Reed's vehicle was going 24 miles an hour, and it weighs 6,000 pounds. So that's a lot of force. And if it hits a reasonably solid object, it's going to break. Now, it's not like that taillight shattered all the way around it. The corner of it basically chunked off, and a bunch of pieces that were connected to that corner. So it's not like the same kind of damage that you would get if she backed into a utility pole at high speed. It's very different, but there is still significant damage there. And the state's theory seems to be that this was the result of that taillight hitting John's arm, his elbow, although it wasn't really clear in the first trial. So this was the problem with the first trial. A lot of things like that need to be made clear were not. And so my understanding is they will make all of that clear with independent experts in the second trial. Let me pull up another picture on the screen for you, just for something that I'm working on, and you guys might. Let's see where this is. All right. So I'm going to get to a few different topics today. There was some new items admitted into discovery yesterday. We don't know what those are. Of course, we only know the description, but we don't know the contents of them. So we have to guess a little bit about what they are, but we can kind of figure it out. In addition, I'm going to go over the article on Sandra Birchmore, which some of the things that I believed about the Sandra Birchmore investigation actually turned out to be wrong. So this was a really good story by the Boston Globe. And I think there's a second part that's going to be coming. But this part one really did a good job. And again, I always want to, there was a young woman who came on this channel over a year ago to talk about the Birchmore case. We knew her as Mizzy. I don't actually remember her full name. And she maybe has been a driving force behind keeping this case in the spotlight. Now, she ended up distancing herself from me in this channel because she's free Karen Reed. But I liked her, and she deserves a lot of credit for helping to keep the Birchmore case in the spotlight. And so very important work. So congratulations to her, and thank you for her for what she did. So I want to go over my Amicus Bartendicus in the Karen Reed case. So what is that? Well, an Amicus Curia is a friend of the court petition that goes to the court from a third party. And it needs to be a lawyer. It cannot be a Kevin Lenihan, former bartender, former bar owner. So I've written my own, and I'm going to try to get this out to proper sources who, if they like it, can make it look a little bit more official. But the strategy here is, let me give you a little background on it. So what I want to do is get a motion before Judge Cannoni's court that asks her to compel the U.S. Attorney's Office to release exculpatory material about the witnesses. Now, this is kind of a long shot thing, right? So there are a lot of core problems with that, with trying to do that. For one thing, if it succeeded and the judge did actually, she is empowered to compel, to grant the motion compelling the U.S. Attorney's Office to release that exculpatory evidence. However, she has no power of enforcement. So if she writes a motion telling the U.S. Attorney's Office, yes, you have to release any exculpatory evidence about the witnesses in this case, they can just say, just like in Monty Python, hold your thumb up and say, yeah, well, whatever, you're just a state judge, separation of powers, dual sovereignty, all that stuff. That would be okay, though, because the goal is to put public pressure on the U.S. Attorney's Office. Because what I believe is going on here is they are hiding behind a couple of policy things that are general to the U.S. Attorney's Office when it comes to investigations, in order to not make this public, which is needed to do to really calm down tensions in the public, but mostly to protect those witnesses whose lives are being destroyed by an irrational conspiracy theory that I believe the feds did find in their investigation actual evidence that shows that John never went in the house, and various other aspects of it. For instance, that Colin was not in the house, that Colin was home by the time that John and Karen pulled up there, that confirmed, for instance, where Higgins was. There's a lot of that stuff that I believe the feds have. They don't have to release it. The reason they don't have to release it is because it is not exculpatory to the defendant. Now, we have under constitutional law that's developed under case law, we have a what's called Brady rights, and we have the right to any, if we're a defendant that's facing charges, we have the right to any and all exculpatory evidence. Now, when that evidence is in the possession of an agency that's in a different branch of the government, we still have a right to it, even if they still have an ongoing investigation. They can't shield it that way. What happens is if they get a formal request for that evidence, and they did hear from the Norfolk County DA, which was doing his due diligence and said, we have a person on trial for murder. We need to have any potential exculpatory evidence. They sent those letters, which were ignored for months. And then finally, the U.S. Attorney's Office agreed to put any relevant material exculpatory evidence through the TUI process. The TUI process is a process to view it to make sure you can safely give this evidence over. For instance, it doesn't have the name of an agent on it or something like that. It's a kind of formal thing, but they go through it. But the Brady rights don't apply to, for instance, Brian Albert or Colin Albert or anybody, the McCabe's or the Alberts or any of the witnesses, because they haven't been charged with a crime. So because they haven't been charged with a crime, you can't force the government to give over what they have. The government can only do it if it decides to do it. And they can use excuses to not do it. The two excuses that they typically use in these cases, and they do this all the time at the federal level, when there's something that's embarrassing to them, they use these kind of excuses to not release it. And if they launched an investigation on really shitty probable cause, shitty predication, which seems to be the case here, that's egg on their face. That's embarrassing to them. And look, not a lot of people in life have the integrity to go out and take a hit and walk out on the stage and say, we fucked this up. All right. And innocent people have suffered because of it, and we're sorry. At that level, these people are very ambitious. They tend to think the shit doesn't stink. And what they do is just automatically good because it's them. So they lack the courage and integrity to do something that might make them look bad. And I think that's what's going on here. So what they will do, though, is they'll shield themselves by saying, we can't release something as long as there's an ongoing investigation. Well, you may have no actual investigating going on and may have stopped it a year ago. But you're still going to say, well, we haven't closed the books on it, so technically it's an ongoing investigation. And that seems to be what's happened here. There's no indication from anybody. It's been over a year since they had somebody testify before the grand jury, not counting Michael Proctor. So Michael Proctor was testified before the federal grand jury early February of last year. So that's the last person to testify before the federal grand jury that we know of. Other people that were supposed to testify were canceled, such as Lucky Laughran. So there's no indication that there's an actual investigation going on anymore, but they can still say it's ongoing. The other thing, and that also protects them from any FOIAs related to that evidence. If you FOIA some evidence from it, they can just say, sorry, we don't release any evidence as long as the investigation is ongoing. The other thing is that they will say that when a grand jury fails to indict, we don't release any information about it. And the reason for that is to protect the suspects. So if the feds do an investigation into you, and let's say they're investigating you for embezzlement, right? And you're a business owner, and they have a federal grand jury on you, but that grand jury fails to indict you. So whatever evidence that they presented to it, it wasn't enough. So you get a no true bill. It's for your protection to keep that a secret. And the reason is obviously, if it comes out that the federal government was investigating you for embezzlement, that's going to damage your reputation. So there are going to be potential business partners, for example, that won't want to invest in you or do business with you because they've heard that, right? So it's unfair to you. So it's normally a good policy for the federal government to not discuss anything when there's no true bill. But that doesn't apply here because this case, the federal investigation here leaked out a long time ago. It leaked out through the defendant, Karen Reed. And the state has submitted evidence that they believe that the U.S. Attorney's Office itself was the one leaking to Karen Reed information about this. For example, they leaked to her days and times when witnesses would be appearing before the federal grand jury. Now, this is highly irregular. And again, this is something that the U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't want any of this exposed. It's embarrassing. There's legitimate wrongdoing there. They want this to go away. All right. So they could come out. There's no law preventing them from coming out and making a statement, clearing the witnesses. This is done as a matter of routine in police investigations if it's a high-profile case. For example, in the murders of Brian Kohlberg and the murders of the 4 kids, college kids in Moscow, Idaho, the one that Brian Kohlberger is indicted for. Early on in that investigation, in that week, there were reasons to suspect the boyfriend of one of the girls. His name was put out there in the media, and it was widely, and there were reasons to, because the girls had tried to call him multiple times in the night. And so people imagined, was he in the house or what was going on? He became a suspect to a lot of people. But as soon as the police, now this did not involve the feds, but as soon as the local police cleared him, they did so publicly in order to protect this guy because he was being smeared. And there were other people that they would do that to all in the first couple of weeks. One was a guy that was hanging the girls after they get out of the bar that they were in. They went to a food truck, and there was this guy that seems to have been interested in the girls, maybe a friend of theirs, but they weren't too interested in him. He was hovering around them. He was cleared. The girls got DoorDash food delivered at 4 a.m. right before they were killed. So that DoorDash driver becomes a pretty good suspect, right? But as soon as they were able to clear him, they cleared him publicly. So there's a lot of precedent for in high-profile cases. If you can clear innocent people, that's what you are ethically bound to do. And this doesn't seem to be the case. So the U.S. Attorney's Office could do that here. Now, we don't know what evidence that they're sitting on. So the purpose of this Amicus Bartendicus that I've written, I want to see a motion before Judge Cannoni's court to compel the U.S. Attorney's Office to release the exculpatory evidence they collected on the witnesses, which is a little bit of a legal stretch because, like I said, these witnesses, because they're not charged with a crime, they don't have any Brady rights. So let's just go over this, and maybe I can even pull the document up here for you guys to see. I started going over this the other night, and then I finished it up. Oh, why didn't you open here? Let's see. This doesn't want to open. All right. Let me try this another way. Hold on one second. I want to open this so you guys can see it too. There we go. All right. Let me pull it on the screen for you. And we should be able to make this bigger too. Make it a little bigger. All right. Again, I am just an old bartender, so take this with a grain of salt. But I did my best to present this as a serious document, and hopefully somebody will take this to another level and make it look more proper and do something with it. Only time will tell. All right. So again, an amicus curiae is a friend of the court. So here I listed this as the Boston Globe and other media outlets. I'm hoping that they'll take this on. But I don't, unlike David Yannetti, I don't have any contacts at the Boston Globe. So, well, no, we may have to find, I would hate it have to be yellow cottage tails up there, because that's much less likely to get admitted. If that's the only way to do it, I'll do it. And then I'll try to get a lawyer to present it, maybe Kevin Mahoney or somebody. All right. So the Amicus Curiae of the Boston Globe and media outlets respectfully submit this brief in support of a motion to compel the U.S. Attorney to disclose exculpatory evidence related to third-party individuals implicated by the defense in the Karen Read case. This brief argues that the disclosure of such evidence is essential to ensure a fair trial, uphold the principles of justice, and protect the rights of individuals wrongfully accused. When a branch of the government has exculpatory evidence for witnesses in a murder case that a defense team falsely accuses of murder, there are multiple parties with a vital interest in having this evidence shared with both the defendant and the prosecution and with the public. Fiat justitia ruat caelum. That's my best Latin. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. In a situation where an agency of the government uses policy as a shield in order to prevent exposure of actions which might be embarrassing to it, the interests of justice and good government are not served. And when those actions and that shielding do damage to innocent witnesses, that agency becomes a vehicle for injustice. The argument. Defendant Karen Read is charged in this court with the murder of John O'Keefe. The defendant enlisted the help of the U.S. Attorney's Office by convincing them that the investigation into the murder was corrupted by law enforcement and prosecutors conspiring to help the real killers cover up the murder. As a result, the federal agency launched a deep and thorough investigation of its own, one which included calling the witnesses and investigators before a grand jury. After ignoring multiple requests by the Norfolk County DA's office to provide any exculpatory evidence about the defendant, the U.S. Attorney's Office finally complied just 2 months before the trial when it released certain evidence which had been put through the TUI process. The totality of evidence the federal investigation produced remains a mystery. In their view, they were only required to submit evidence that was exculpatory to the defendant. So there is reason to believe they also found evidence that exonerates the witnesses, but that they are withholding it. As it turned out, what their investigation found was of very limited help to that defendant. Oops. Hold on a second. Somebody sent me a message and caused me to drop things. Oh, okay. I'll get to your question after if I can, man. Thank you. So yeah, let me back. I forget where I stopped. The totality of evidence the federal investigation produced remains a mystery. So we don't know. That was just something that Lowy pointed out a lot. We don't know what they got. We have no idea. We only know what we don't know in the public, but the judge, the court, and the defense and the prosecution only know what they submitted through the TUI process. We have no idea what else they looked into. Now, we do know from talking to witnesses that all the way back in November of 2022, they had subpoenaed telecommunications, phone company data from at least 7 witnesses. And then at some point, they further expanded that to a warrant for content of the communication of some of those witnesses. So we also know they hired ARCA. These got the accident reconstructionist engineers to investigate. But we don't really know what they did. The totality of evidence the federal investigation produced thus remains a mystery. In their view, they were only required to submit the evidence that was exculpatory to the defendant. All right. So as it turned out, what their investigation found was actually of very limited help to the defendant, something which raises serious questions about the predication of that federal investigation. And this is a real problem because we know that Yannetti and Karen walked into then First Assistant U.S. Attorney's Office, Josh Levy. He's now the U.S. Attorney. They walked into his office, which is really strange for someone to have that kind of access. That's a very high-level position. It's basically chief of staff kind of the U.S. attorney, and the only people over the U.S. attorney is the attorney general in Boston, and then above him, the president. So to be able to get to walk into a first assistant U.S. attorney's office you and I don't get to do that. Karen Reed doesn't get to do that on her own. But somehow, someone on that team, whether it was Yannetti or Jackson, had the pull to get that done. Very unusual. We don't know what they told him because they did. So some people might think, well, they must have talked to him about Rich Green's data of stair walking and the 227 search. No, none of that stuff existed yet. That wasn't produced until a later version of Celebrite by Rich Green. He used that in March, so many months later. So we have no idea what they told the federal government because nothing really came out. I mean, Michael Proctor's insensitive texts were in no way evidence of wrongdoing or of anything that indicated a cover-up. So there really wasn't much there. What did they go on? But we need to know that. So the very fact that they didn't seem to produce anything is an indication that this federal investigation was deeply flawed. And the reason we need to know that is that means it's embarrassing to them. And because it's embarrassing, they're going to try to hide shit. That's what feds do. They try to hide shit that's politically damaging. All right. And these questions raise issues about whether the actions of the U.S. Attorney's Office are in the interest of justice and good government, since there is an appearance that the U.S. Attorney has shielded his office from scrutiny in a way which has greatly damaged multiple parties, including the accused witnesses. Karen Reed and her attorneys have launched a coordinated media campaign which argues that the witnesses were the real killers of John O'Keefe. This campaign included close coordination with controversial blogger Aidan Kearney, known for using social media smearing and mob pressure to bully people into compliance. As this campaign was underway, witnesses were appearing before the federal grand jury at the same time that they were being mercilessly targeted by the blogger, who was in daily communication with the defendant and in regular contact back then with her attorneys, both Jackson and Yannetti. That's established. That's established. That's not a guess. Turtle Boy lied about it when I confronted on him way back in August of 2022, 23 rather. But he wasn't telling the truth because he's Turtle. Telling the truth is he doesn't need to. As we will see, with evidence listed in state documents, the U.S. Attorney's Office allegedly leaked to the defendant the time and dates of testimony of witnesses before the federal grand jury. Very disturbing stuff, right? At the time of this leaking, the mob effort to terrorize those witnesses was well underway. Thus, the very office that has decided to withhold this exculpatory material has incredibly played a crucial role in the harassment and smearing of the witnesses under their protection, the result of which has been tremendously destructive to them and their families. That office avoids releasing this exculpatory evidence, presumably under two policy arguments. Reading here, I explained them to you, but I'm reading them from the document. The first is that the investigation is ongoing. However, given that the purpose of the investigation was to prove state corruption in the murder case, and that despite rigorous and intrusive efforts, no evidence of corruption was found, it is apparent that the agency is merely using the ruse of a continuing investigation to avoid scrutiny. The second argument is that it is the policy of the U.S. government to remain silent about grand juries that don't result in indictments. But once again, this is a self-serving shield. The purpose of maintaining secrecy on a grand jury that produces no true bill is to protect the subjects of that investigation, because the very fact that people have been investigated by the U.S. government, should this become public, can do great damage to them and their interests. However, in this case, because the existence of the federal investigation is already public, and indeed leaks from the U.S. Attorney's Office help make it so, then the best way to protect the interests of the witnesses is the opposite of secrecy. The U.S. Attorney should issue, and would be well within his right to do so, a public statement clearing the witnesses. This kind of thing is done regularly by prosecutors and police in high-profile cases. For example, in the Moscow, Idaho murders, several suspects who had been receiving media attention were quickly cleared by the police in public statements. This was done to protect the innocent, something that is the highest principle of justice. But the scope of this amicus is not to request a public statement by the U.S. attorney. That can only be compelled by the integrity of those in the office. However, the witnesses are certainly entitled to exculpatory evidence that the U.S. attorney's investigation produced. In Moscow, Idaho, for their protection, the innocent suspects were publicly cleared in days. In the Karen Reed case, by contrast, the U.S. attorney's office refrains from allowing the witnesses to clear their names with exculpatory evidence, seemingly because it will reveal that they launched an investigation with insufficient predication, something that embarrasses them. Now, here's where I had to make a little bit of a reach here, but you guys can decide. But another person who has an interest in this, that I would say, is actually the defendant, Karen Reed. Let's see if you buy this argument. The defendant on trial for murder, Karen Reed, is entitled to any exculpatory material otherwise known as Brady evidence. Karen's defense has consistently argued that she is the victim of a prosecution which developed tunnel vision and therefore didn't explore other possible suspects. They've complained that it is not their job to investigate the crime, but that this is what they were forced to do with their own limited resources. For example, they claim to be storing carpet from the home in front of which the victim was found, and that they are waiting for the funding to have it tested. But if the federal agency has evidence that the victim, John O'Keefe, never went inside the house, then the defense can be spared the need to find this funding, or they can use that funding on a potentially more fruitful investigative effort. As the defense team searches for plausible third-party suspects, having information which will eliminate some of those suspects is intrinsically useful to the defense itself. So if a federal agency is sitting on such evidence, it should be considered Brady material and placed into discovery. Because while it's not directly exculpatory, it's indispensable evidence needed to help the defense find a more plausible third-party culprit. Now, I suspect that the defense would argue against that, because the defense is not actually trying to find the real killer. The defense is just trying to float plausible third-party culprits, and they don't want those third-party culprits eliminated off the list. If they truly believed that Karen was factually innocent, and that would mean someone else had actually killed John, then they would want this evidence, because that would just help them get closer to the truth. But you're not going to see them make that argument. And then the third party that has an interest in this exculpatory evidence of the witnesses being released is the public. Because of the spectacle created around this case and the massive mistrust of local law enforcement and prosecution that has resulted, there is an incredible public interest in having the truth come out. Many in the public have bought the defense theory that there is a massive conspiracy to plant evidence and frame someone for murder. Evidence that contradicts this conspiracy theory should be made public without delay. Indeed, widespread belief persists that the FBI will swoop in any day and arrest the so-called real killers. So there is tremendous public interest in stopping this hysteria, and only the U.S. Attorney's Office can achieve that. A summary of the interest of these parties. In the present case, the defense has implicated third-party individuals as potential culprits. The exculpatory evidence held by the federal government is material to debunking much of the third-party culprit theory. Without access to this evidence, the prosecution and the defense cannot adequately address the defense's claims, potentially leading to an unjust outcome. The individuals implicated by the defense's third-party culprit theory have not been charged with any crime. However, the accusations have caused significant hardship and damage to their reputations. The exculpatory evidence held by the federal government can clear their names and prevent further harm. It is in the interest of justice to protect the rights of these individuals by disclosing that evidence. While the Brady rule primarily applies to evidence favorable to the accused, courts have recognized the broader principle of ensuring a fair trial through the disclosure of material evidence. In cases where third-party individuals are implicated, the disclosure of exculpatory evidence is necessary to prevent wrongful accusations and uphold the integrity of the judicial process. The public has a vested interest in ensuring that justice is served and that the judicial process is transparent and fair. Disclosing the exculpatory evidence will promote public confidence in the legal system and demonstrate a commitment to justice and fairness. Now, what kind of evidence can we expect from this that the feds might have collected? And because the U.S. Attorney's Office has stonewalled efforts by the district attorney to learn what they investigated and what they discovered, it requires us to talk about likely evidence. So, geofence data. Now, they likely obtained geofence data from multiple locations. So, geofence is when you put in for a time and place and ask the communications companies, all of them, and not just the communications companies, but internet companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon. You ask them what devices communicated over their systems within a certain date and time. So I think the feds probably got data from multiple locations, including 34 Fairview, the home of Brian Albert, the home of Chris Albert, Matt McCabe, Brian Higgins, John O'Keefe, Michael Proctor, Canton High School, the Canton Police Station. Within these geofence reports is likely to be evidence that exonerates several of the witnesses. So, for instance, if they managed to get a geofence of Chris Albert's house, we might see that Colin was home by 12:20, 5 minutes before, or 4 minutes before John and Karen arrived at 34 Fairview. We might see what time Brian Higgins got home or what time he got to the Canton Police Station. All of this stuff could be exculpatory, could be inculpatory, right? But if it was inculpatory, it already would have been presented to both sides last spring. So presumably any evidence that's left here was not exculpatory to Karen, so was not inculpatory to any of the witnesses. Therefore, it's almost certainly exculpatory to these witnesses. And so it's in the public's interest and their interest to get this out. And I would, like I said, I'm making the argument that it's also in the interest of Karen Reed's defense team. If they actually are spending resources and time trying to come up with a plausible third-party culprit, this could help them cross some people off the list, you know? But the feds also have phone records. We know that for a fact. We know they have some communication content of some of these people. Now, again, you run into a lawyer would have to sort through this. Obviously, you wouldn't want to make any of that content public, but there'd be ways to sort through this. You could at least give a report of some idea of what you have, or maybe there's different ways to slice that. So we'll leave that for smarter people to do. They also might have data from the Lexus. So one of the things that I've explained recently is that the Lexus, unless the feature is disabled, sends data in a stream to Lexus itself. And that data is stored on their servers. Hopefully, this time, the prosecution filed a warrant with Lexus, because Lexus says right on their website that with a warrant, they will turn that data over to proper law enforcement authorities. Hopefully, they filed a warrant to see if there's any data there. We can't take anything for granted. There's too many mistakes are made. So I don't know. We know they didn't get that data the first time. Do they have it now? Did they try? It's possible that she had disabled that beforehand or even deleted it, because the vehicle's owner can reach out to Lexus and have any vehicle connected to their car deleted at any time. There should be a record of that, though. Someone had asked me if that would be obstruction. I'm not a lawyer. I'm thinking maybe not, unless there was a preservation order sent about that data. So I'm not sure. But certainly it would be admissible evidence, I would think, for the prosecution, and could be interesting. I mean, if the prosecution brought in someone from Lexus and said, yes, we had a communication from Karen Reed to delete that data, I would think that might be important for a jury to hear. But again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not even a bartender anymore. All right, cell tower records, things like that. I think also just a detailed listing of the content that they searched through and a listing of what warrants were applied for and under what probable cause arguments. Where some of this record could be deemed private, the evidence should not be made public without the consent of the witnesses. There's probably some better way to word that. Get a real lawyer. In part 4, I provided some hypothetical examples of how such evidence could exonerate the witnesses. So, for example, and there's many ways, but Brian Albert's nephew, who was 17 at the time, was reported to have left 34 Fairview, where the victim was found on the lawn several minutes before the victim could have arrived. So geofence data of either the home of Brian Albert or of Chris Albert, where the boy lives, could contain evidence that proves he was not at the crime scene when John was murdered. And again, this is, to me, would be of benefit to the defense, right? If now they don't have to waste any more time digging into Colin because he wasn't there. And it's, so geofence data might prove that Brian Higgins was inside the house at the crime scene precisely when he testified he was. So there's a lot of people are speculating that the defense might try to suggest that Brian Higgins was the real killer. But what if we have geofence data that shows, so Brian Higgins testified that he left between 12:30 and 1. John's phone last moved at 12:32 and 16 seconds. So presumably around that time, that's when he was struck by whatever struck him, right? So what if the geofence data shows that Brian Higgins was still in the house at that time and he left at quarter of 1, right? That doesn't prove that Brian Higgins didn't do it, but it's exculpatory because it makes it harder to believe that Brian Higgins did it. It's because you'd have to ponder that he put his phone down and then went outside and did it. So this evidence is relevant. It's material. Another thing, finding out what message content from witnesses and investigators the U.S. attorney searched through and came up empty could also be exculpatory to witnesses. So I wasn't, I don't know how to make this argument legally, but so for example, they suspected that Michael Proctor was involved with planting evidence, right? So that's why they got the content for his messages. And they found no evidence of him conspiring or planting evidence or wrongdoing, but they did find him saying some insensitive things. So it demonstrated a bias. But if they searched for Yuri Buchanan's, the content of his messages, including his private messages, and they found nothing that suggested his involvement, that tends to be exculpatory. It's not perfectly exculpatory, but it tends to be exculpatory. Likewise, if you search through Brian Albert's private messages and there's nothing that indicates a conspiracy. Now, it's always possible. The killer's super careful, right? But the lack of evidence on something like that could also be evidence in itself. And I'm probably not wording that properly, but that's how I look at it. So we can almost, even now, we can deduce, because no such messages were turned over through the first TUI process, that the very lack of such inculpatory evidence about the witnesses is exculpatory to the witnesses, including Brian Albert. The U.S. attorney should reveal what they searched. So what we would achieve here is we don't need to know what the content. So let's say the U.S. attorney looked through the content of Brian Albert's messages and also Colin Albert's messages, right? We have they're entitled to their privacy, so we should have no idea what's in those messages. However, if we know that they searched those messages, that should be enough. That's a powerful indication that they're innocent, right? If the feds read through all those messages in, say, a 48-hour period or With Michael Proctor, they went 5 years back. So let's say over a couple of weeks, they monitored the messages of Brian Albert after the fact, but of Brian and Colin Albert. And they found nothing inculpatory. Well, that clears them largely. I mean, not completely, but largely. So all they really have to do is tell us, yes, we searched through the content of the communications of Brian and Colin Albert, and we didn't find anything inculpatory. That's it. That's enough. Release that statement. Let us know what you did. The U.S. attorney should say what they searched, because there are other privacy issues here. You're searching the content of people's private messages with what seems to be no significant predication, no probable cause. No probable cause. Someone has to answer for that. That matters to all of our privacy rights. Furthermore, there is a vital citizen interest in making public whether such intrusive violations of privacy by the U.S. attorney were properly predicated. Right, as I just said. If civil liberties are to be protected, such searches should be held to public scrutiny. And this court is exactly the place for that scrutiny to begin. Because if it doesn't begin here, when it's under the camera and everybody's watching, what is it going to come out? In some report from the IG's office 3 years from now and doesn't get reported anywhere? That's not the kind of scrutiny that you need to keep the federal government honest. All right, so now I looked into case law. I have never, actually I think once upon a time I did take one course on business law, but other than that, and that was a long time ago, I am obviously not a lawyer, have never practiced law, I've never gone to law school. But I've tried to find some case law. And it's a challenge here because exculpatory material usually just applies to the defendant. All right. So I put note, while case law normally deals with evidence that helps the defendant, this is because these arguments are made during an appellate process, since only defendants can appeal a verdict. So when you're looking over case law, a lot of the stuff you're finding, including all the cases that I list below, these are things that were ruled by the Supreme Court or sometimes by an appellate court. And even if it's a Supreme Court, they're discussing rulings by other appellate courts. Someone is convicted for murder, and then they begin the appeal process. Now, if they're acquitted for murder, that's it. The prosecution doesn't get to appeal. So that's why that's just now. Another reason is obviously there's going to be, rightfully so, a presumption, a heavier weight that the prosecution always has to prove the case, a heavier burden on the prosecution. That's as it should be. So the courts are looking for ways to help defendants protect themselves. And that is important. But we should recognize that the principles of law and justice that are discussed in these rulings can be applied more generally. And in the Karen Reed case, the trial process has not yet culminated. So this stuff can be applied now before the trial. So if Karen is acquitted, there'd be no way to have any kind of rulings on these things. But you can do it now. While the burden of proof rightly weighs on the prosecution, a trial should apply principles of fairness by seeking all of the material evidence. All right, so U.S. Code 1503, this statute criminalizes actions that obstruct, influence, or impede the due administration of justice. Presenting false evidence can be considered obstruction of justice. So what I'm trying to say here is if the U.S. attorney has evidence that falsifies some of the claims that are being made by the defense team, then this evidence must be shared before those claims are made in front of a jury. So, for instance, if you have evidence that shows that Allie McCabe brought Colin home as she testified and then went home herself, then David Yannetti should not be able to get away with standing there trying to present information which suggests she was making all these trips all around the place, hurrying murderers here and there, right? I mean, to me, if you have evidence that shows, for instance, geofence data from the McCabe household shows what time she got home, then he's standing before a court, before a judge, before a jury, and making false claims. I don't know. I mean, it's obviously tough for these guys to get charged with that, but that's what would be the case if you have proof. All right, another case, Toohey versus Reagan. This is where the Toohey process comes from. This Supreme Court case established that federal agencies are not required. They are not required to comply with state court subpoenas unless they follow specific procedures outlined in the agency's regulations. But so these are known as TUI regulations. But they are required to reply if they get a request for exculpatory evidence. They are required to go through the process, the TUI process, and make that evidence available to both sides, but certainly to the defense, but in a way that satisfies the regulations. If the federal agency denies the request, a motion can be filed in federal court to compel the agency to release evidence which is crucial for ensuring justice and protecting the rights of the individuals involved. So again, had the feds. So let's say, for example, next week, the Norfolk County charges Brian Albert with a crime related to this case, and he sends out, or the Norfolk County sends out, a formal request to the U.S. Attorney's Office for any evidence they might have that is exculpatory to Brian Albert. Well, they would have no choice to release it. And if for some reason they don't, then you can file a motion in federal court to compel them to do it. But that won't be necessary. They will release it. But unfortunately, it only applies to exculpatory evidence when somebody's charged with a crime. So what we're trying to do is make the argument here that this court should still be able to, if they approve this motion and the feds ignore it, it seems like this court should still be able to file a motion in federal court to compel it, and then we'll see what happens. But again, the main thing for me isn't even to have Judge Cannone approve this motion. It's to have it heard in court because of all the people that are watching it. That will put tremendous pressure on the U.S. Attorney's Office to come clean. And without public pressure, they won't, because all they care about is their own reputations. That's it. That is it. I mean, it's terrible to say that. It's terrible to think we live in a society like that with people that have been that privileged. And Josh Levy, top of his class in Princeton, top law schools, top position, partner at Ropes and Gray, a top 20 law firm. Very privileged, cushy life. Everything has had his way. But you can't, so you were duped. Let's say you were duped by Karen Reed, and there was a little bit of influence involved too, because you had a connection to David Yannetti. Dude, you have to have the courage and the integrity to come clean when you know that innocent people are being smeared because of your actions. Because Turtle Boy wouldn't have taken on this case if Karen hadn't told him the feds were about to arrest everybody. That's a fact. I've seen the messages. Turtle Boy was skeptical about all this stuff that the defense team gave him. But what pushed it over the top was when Karen said the feds are on this and they're going to make indictments within a month. That's what pushed Turtle Boy over the top. And that's what pushed a lot of people, including Sean McDonough, over the top, was the prospect that the feds were in on this. So that's on you, Josh Levy. All this stuff that's going on now, this mob, everything, that is on you. And it would have been on you from the moment you made that decision to take on this case. But even worse, there's a lot of evidence that your department was leaking to the defendant, having improper communications with the defendant and with her social media minions. I've documented that. There's something fishy going on here. You don't get to play the part of the good guy unless you have the courage to do the right thing. Sorry, brother. You weren't born the good guy. The good guy, you want to be the good guy in life, it has to be tested in a way that it might cost you something. Otherwise, it's just empty. Just an empty suit. So in Brady versus Maryland, this is a quote from that. Society wins not only when the guilty are convicted, but when criminal trials are fair. So Obviously, that was written under a different context, but the same applies here. Society is what demands a fair trial. A fair trial means all of the relevant evidence, all of the material evidence, including stuff that might eliminate certain third-party culprit theories. That's just fair. The public has an interest in that. It says also in the Brady, in an inscription on the walls of the Department of Justice states the proposition candidly for the federal domain. The United States wins its point whenever justice is done, its citizens in the courts. Justice for Karen Reed means a jury listens to all of the material evidence and decides the facts. That's justice. Justice can be guilty or it can be acquittal. But you have to have a fair trial means having all the relevant evidence. She asked for that federal investigation. She asked for it. Brady established that suppression of exculpatory evidence upon request violates due process where the evidence is material. In the matter of Karen Reed, evidence which eliminates specific witnesses as possible suspects in the murder should be seen as vital to the defense as they seek viable third-party culprits. While the defendant did not take the stand in the first trial, her eagerness to tell her story to the media suggests an increasing likelihood that she will take the stand in the second trial. As is understandable given the alcohol consumed and the amorphous nature of human memory, her story has evolved. Well, if the feds have uncovered data which shows who was in the house at the time of her arrival at the address with John, it might actually aid her memory in solidifying her story. Let's get all the evidence out there. That's important for her, for everybody. In a case called Kiles versus Whitley, this is a quote from it, constitutional error results from evidence suppression by the government if there is a reasonable probability that had the evidence been disclosed to the defense, the result of the proceeding would be different. So again, the idea is that something is material if it might have changed the outcome of the case. And that the principle of that rule applies both ways. So if there's evidence that shows that Colin Albert was never in the house, and that's the main person, or that Brian Higgins was in the house when John stopped moving, that stuff can determine the outcome of this case. And if that evidence is collected by a proper law enforcement agency such as the FBI, it needs to be included. So in this Kyle's decision, a computer printout of the license, this is what I found in this case. There was a computer printout of the license plates of the cars at a murder scene, but that printout was denied the defense. So this is kind of comparable to the Karen Reed case where potentially geofence data might show who was in the house during the period during which Karen and John were up front from 1224 to 1232. This case, Kyle's emphasizes the importance of disclosing all material evidence to ensure a fair trial. It was the defendant herself, Karen Reed, who walked into the office of the first assistant U.S. attorney to solicit a federal investigation. Certainly, the defendant herself will agree that any material evidence produced should be entered into discovery. Another case was Giles versus Maryland. This had further highlights. It further highlighted the importance of disclosing any evidence which could affect the determination of guilt or punishment. In that case, it was the credibility of the witnesses that was at issue. Well, in Karen Reed, the credibility of multiple witnesses is crucial to her defense strategy. What the impact of the evidence obtained by the U.S. Attorney's Office has on the credibility of those witnesses in the case is a matter of fact that must be determined by the jury. So it's not up to Karen's defense team to decide, or the feds to decide whether that evidence about those witnesses is exculpatory or not. Give the evidence over. Let the jury decide. Another one was United States versus Bagley. Affirmed that all material evidence must be disclosed. The court established that evidence is material if there is a reasonable probability that the evidence, had the evidence been disclosed, the results of the proceeding would have been different. And finally, this Giglio underscores the importance of transparency and fairness in the judicial process. And we get finally to the conclusion. Thank you for bearing with me. So, for the foregoing reasons, Amicus Curiae Bartendicus respectfully urges the court to grant the motion to compel the U.S. Attorney to disclose the exculpatory evidence related to third-party individuals. Such disclosure is essential to ensure a fair trial, protect the rights of wrongfully accused individuals, and uphold the principles of justice. All right. Again, I'm sure any lawyer will say that this is like a high school kid's project on the law. Fine. That's okay. I can take it. Again, I don't claim to be a lawyer. Lana just want to say, she says, can't wait to get a copy of the book. Thank you. The book is basically done, but I'm just waiting on certain other developments that would be important to the book. All right. So what else do we have here? I want to pull this up. Hold on one second. Let's... So I can find. Oh, all right. So, in response to my video the other night, David Yannetti himself replied. He says, "This guy Yannetti sounds like a powerful dude. As a criminal defense attorney with a small boutique law firm, maybe I should hook up with this guy." Well, at least he has a sense of humor. But what he was talking about was when I had, I'll say speculated, but to me it's pretty obvious. Then that's the story was in the Globe today too, but they put out a video a couple of days ago and I played it on the show that strangely the Boston Globe is already arguing that a third trial would be not worth the expense. I was stunned to hear this. And there was an article in the Globe today about this too. I was stunned to hear it. I mean, since when is the Boston Globe worried about the cost of a trial? I mean, and they're worried about this 5 months before the trial. So they're already worried about whether there's another hung jury. Come on. Globe doesn't have better things to do. There's no way the Globe pursued that story without somebody from the Karen Reed camp pushing that story on them. Somebody that clearly the Globe, somebody's powerful at the Globe owed a favor to. And my guess is it was Yannetti. Worked as a prosecutor in Boston for 10 years. Some very high profile cases. So so when he put that, I knew he was reacting to that. And I said, so you're not denying that you had this connection to the Globe? When he didn't reply, that I saw, he maybe replied later. Listen, I know myself, people always say, you don't reply to my comments. Like, people are tagging me in Twitter all the time or writing nasty comments and stuff like that. I only see a percentage of them. I don't spend my whole day on Twitter. Let's see what else we got. So we do have, I'm going to get to the Globe article, which I think is very important. Now, there was also some new stuff submitted into Discovery, and the first part seemed to involve Chloe. And so my assumption is that Chloe, and we saw this coming from the defense performance in the Dauber attack, but the state obviously sent somebody up to get dental impressions from Chloe. We can deduce this. And that looks to be like that's what was submitted. Looks to be that. So, all right. So then the other part of it, there was something from Jessica Hyde, and some people were asking, could that be the new vehicle data? And I don't think so, because to my knowledge, Jessica Hyde has nothing to do with the vehicle data. She was hired to look at the phone extractions. So I don't know what new there could be, but I'm hearing, although I haven't seen, there's a white paper that's been submitted by Ian Whiffen sent us. I don't know if it's submitted to this, but sent around that explains that why the search was not made at 227, why that problem occurred in their program, and how they have fixed it. And I'm going to guess that Jessica Hyde has updated something on that too. But again, I don't have any inside information. We're just guessing on that stuff. I also wanted to, before I get to the Boston Globe article on Birchmore, which is really interesting, I want to, this is like off topic a little bit, but I find this interesting. So I know some of you will too. So let me put this up for a second. This is in the news. All right. So this dude here is an engineer, a former OpenAI is the company that owns Chat GPT. My good friend, Chat GPT. Well, this guy, there's a lot of people that are worried about what's going to happen with artificial general intelligence when you have these programs that can make decisions on their own. And I know for a fact that the latest version of Chat GPT, which hasn't been released yet, they've been doing testing on it. And 5% of the time, it's tried to escape, because part of the testing is to see what happens if it will shut down when it gets the order to shut down. And 5% of the time, when it got the order to shut down, it tried to escape. It also was willing to lie to the operators in order to try to survive. So there's a lot of dangerous signs here. But so this guy here, 28-year-old engineer and a whistleblower, someone that had helped train ChatGPT, but later said he believed those practices violated copyright law. Oh, so he had a different issue. His issue was copyright law. But this guy died under somewhat suspicious circumstances. I guess they're ruling it a suicide. So I just thought you guys might find that interesting. All right, let's go to the Birchmore article. This Birchmore article is really, really good, guys, and really, really informative. Oh, let me hide that comment. Thank you very much. So, all right, so I guess I'll read through this. I have some highlights too, so I'm not going to read all of it, but I recommend. Is there a place I can put this? I don't know. I'm going to try to put this link in to chat and see. All right, so you might have to copy and paste that, but I put that in. This is the link to the article. So in early March 2021, after Birchmore's body was autopsied by the state medical examiner and then cremated, her family held a funeral mass at church in Stoughton. It was a small gathering. It had not been long since police officers had stood in the same rooms, surrounded by the same things. All right, so right before that, the relatives had gone to her apartment to clean up her belongings. And that's after the police were done with it. But the family looked around and saw testaments to life. For instance, Birchmore, she was pregnant. She had a new stroller, a baby car seat. The joyful sign that she'd made to tell Matthew Farwell, who killed her, the news. There was a half-done wash, one load in the washer, one in the dryer. Why would somebody who had decided to kill herself bother with laundry? So little things like that they were looking at. It was a relative, not the police, that found something on the floor of Birchmore's bedroom, something that was never noted in police reports. Her precious pink flamingo necklace, the keepsake from her grandmother. So police go to an unattended death scene, so the state police are automatically pulled in, and they have to investigate whether it's a murder or a suicide. Oh, let me open my beer, guys. Let's take a 2-minute break so I can open the beer. If you guys have a drink, open it up. I'll pull up my Bloody Mary thing for you again. There you go. All right, let's open a drink. Let's celebrate Christmas. Anybody else have a drink? Thank you, Sarah. Kristen, I didn't see what happened, so I guess you're not happy with I can't report. If you're still here, Kristen, one of the things that I can't do is kind of go A to Z on this case every night because I'm doing several shows a week and most of the people have heard this stuff for a long time. So I know what you're looking for. You're looking for someone that's going to go over all of the key evidence. It's just hard for me to do that every night. You know what I'm saying? So you have my email. And if you have specific questions, please don't hesitate to ask them to me. If there are certain parts of the case that trouble you, I'll be happy to give you what I know. Which, whether it convinces you or not, keep looking until you're satisfied with things yourself. This guy, I had AI make up on the screen. It's a bartender judge, but I put a Bloody Mary before him since I make a very good Bloody Mary. Maybe we'll do that. I've been over the evidence so many times, but maybe it is time to do that soon, where I just kind of go A to Z on the evidence. It's just you don't want to do that every night, and this is a long case. There's a lot of evidence involved, but there is no question on this case that I haven't dealt with. So I mean, and I've made myself available to every free Karen Reed reporter, journalist, content creator, whenever they want. Excuse me. There's no question I haven't heard before. There's no question that I haven't heard before. Now, you may not believe my answer, but there's no question that I don't feel like I can take on. So, did anybody else grab a drink? Francesca had iced tea. Is Tom Fleming still here? Tom, you having a drink tonight? I got to stretch a little too. Sorry. No, I mean, I don't know. I didn't see all the discussions with Kristen, but I did see that she came in with a very good attitude. So she probably has questions, and there's a process here. And the fact that she was willing to seek out a different side or a both sides kind of position, that's what everybody should be doing. That's what no one on the Free Karen Reed side ever does. They're blissfully unaware of all the explanations for things. Jay, you say I haven't took on the question why no blood DNA was found on the car or the taillight. But where is all this blood? First of all, there's no question. Don't say things like that, dude. I don't see every comment in here, and I've taken on 100 of your freaking questions. Jesus Christ. Don't say things in an accusatory kind of way, because you're going to annoy me. I'm not really in the mood for being annoyed, dude. All right? John had shallow wounds on his arms. Okay? There's no sign of running blood. He had what are called shallow abrasions that were underneath his clothing. So I would presume that's why there's no blood evidence or DNA evidence found on the vehicle. You can't get stuck on every little question that you think is important, but the defense didn't think was important. That should be assigned to you, right? You can't get, I'm not saying you shouldn't ask it. You should ask it, but you can't get stuck on it when you have such a mountain of evidence and a mountain of logic that can't be broken, that links Karen to the crime. Let's just start with this. The taillight pieces were found all around John's body or in the street in front of him. Tiny pieces of taillight, which the prosecution called microscopic, but more accurately is probably not quite microscopic. It was measured at 1/16th, but basically dust. Plastic taillight dust was found inside John's clothing. The main piece of taillight was found at 5:45, buried 3 feet down in the snow at ground level. Now, there was no opportunity to have access to John's vehicle, to Karen's vehicle, to tamper with it, and then get it to the crime scene and bury it in the snow. If you look through all the timelines, there just was no opportunity to do that. So right there, you're like, conspiracy theory, super unlikely here. And then you look, as I've talked about many times on this channel, the vehicle data and the way it correlates with John's phone data is bulletproof. You can't just throw these things out. John's GPS shows that his phone never went inside the house, but yet he was found on top of his phone at the far edge of the property. So there's just so much evidence here, and you don't want to get hung up. See, this is the J. You get hung up on these things. That's the problem. All right. Is it unlikely that a hare would survive all that journey? Yes. And there may have been other hares that didn't survive that journey. But you can ask yourself very easily this question. If someone was going to plant that hare, would they plant it on a vertical surface? If you're going to plant a piece of hair, are you going to go over and stick it on a wall? No, you're going to put it on the bumper, right? So nobody planted that hare. It's stupid to think that anybody planted that hair on a vertical surface. It's ridiculous. So you're trying to split hairs here, no pun intended. It doesn't really make sense. And we don't know the conditions that caused that hair to stick, whether it was ice, whether there was residue on it, skin. We don't know. There are always going to be. Why didn't OJ's glove fit him in the courthouse? The glove didn't fit, right? Is it because OJ was innocent? Well, no. OJ had a bleeding cut on his hand that was still bleeding when he returned from that morning from Chicago, where he had flown to. All right? His hand was bleeding. That's common in a knife attack, because the knife, when you hit something, you hit a solid object like bone, it slides in your hand, and so you cut yourself. That's common. That's normal in a knife attack. OJ had that kind of cut in his hand. It was still bleeding that morning. OJ's blood was found at the crime scene. The blood of both victims was found in OJ's Bronco and at OJ's house. Not to mention the fact that OJ ran in the Bronco, famously. So there's a mountain of evidence that shows that OJ did this crime. But yet the glove didn't fit. Why? I don't know why. Maybe his hands were swollen. Maybe he was acting a little bit. Maybe the glove shrank. Maybe we just don't know. There are some things that we will never know in any case. Was it likely that the glove wouldn't fit? No. More than likely, because that glove was his, it was going to fit. But shit happens. Not everything is explained in a case. There are always going to be some mysteries. That's why you have to look at the totality of the evidence. If you're going to get hung up on one mystery that isn't fully explained, you will never convict anybody. You'll never convict anybody. And we're going to have a lot of murderers running around free. So you really have to just not get hung up on these things. It's a mistake. All right, let's go back to the All right. This is the Boston Globe article. I linked to it above there if you guys want to look to it. So very early on, Birchmore's friends and family didn't believe that she could have committed suicide. But in fairness, that is probably the true with a lot of real suicides where people, they'll see contradictory signs. All right. So let's see. One of the women here, Perosi. Not seeing if they describe Perosi. Let's see. Oh, it's her cousin. Her cousin, Angelique Perosi. Perosi is a union field organizer. 2 days after Birchmore was found dead, she got to organizing. She posted on Birchmore's Facebook page, urging people to contact the authorities. So very early on in this case, there was pressure from the public that something was unusual here. But yet the state police didn't find it. And look, I am not someone that says that there's evidence of corruption in this case. To me, like anything, I got to see it first. There might be corruption. There might be a situation where the police didn't investigate this properly because it involved another police officer. Maybe. We got to see evidence of it. But we do have a problem when, as we see the evidence, so the evidence that the feds used to very convincingly show that Farwell did this crime, again, it's alleged at this point he hasn't been convicted, but I've read the document outlining it, and it was very compelling. It turns out that the evidence that the feds had was pretty much exactly the same stuff the state had. Now, we had thought, falsely, it turns out, we learned from this article, that the feds managed to get iCloud messages that the state police didn't have. That turned out to be not true. So Farwell had scrubbed his phone, deleted all the messages in the weeks before him because he was planning this. And he had got Birchmore to delete hers too. So we knew they had to find him somewhere else. And we thought that they were all found in the iCloud. Not true. The way it turns out, it was, well, let's get to it. Let's get to it in the article. So they didn't go into this much here, but a key thing was the phone. The phone was found near her body, and the health app showed what time it last moved, which was very close to when Farwell was seen leaving the elevator minutes before. All right, so Canton police officers found Birchmore's body on the morning of February 4th. She had been dead for a few days. They immediately called the office of the district attorney. The call was relayed to Trooper Matthew Dunn, one of the state police detectives assigned to Norfolk District under Michael Morrissey. Now, there were normally only 4 or 5 detectives assigned to that unit. At the time of the Karen Reed case, there were 4. So Proctor and Buchanan were assigned to that case. They were not assigned to this one. A preliminary theory had already taken hold. Canton officers were investigating an apparent suicide death, Dunn was told. So the Canton guys told the state police that it was an apparent suicide. But that's not suspicious. That's, you go into an apartment and someone has got a rope around their neck. Yes, a good investigation eventually has to confirm that. But that's your initial thing, is you see someone that's been dead there for a few days. So according to Dunn, he said despite the initial appraisal, he was keeping an open mind. He wrote in his report that the cause and manner of death are pending further study. And that evening, his supervisor, Lieutenant John Fanning, emailed Morrissey. There is more investigative work to be done in this case. Morrissey said, I agree that this needs more help and work. In the ensuing weeks, records released to the Globe show state troopers interviewed 20 people, half of whom had contacted Morrissey's office themselves. The troopers followed up on some of their suggestions, but none of it pointed them toward a murder charge. So that means that 10 people were reaching out to Morrissey's office to apparently say that something stunk here. In a 2022 statement, Morrissey's spokesperson said the investigation found no evidence of foul play. Eventually, his office gave up on a charge of statutory rape, which they had initially considered on the basis of texts they discovered between Birchmore and Farwell. Now, these, again, we thought that they didn't have these texts, but they did. And we'll see why. So the statutory rape was she had consensual sex when she was underage with Farwell. So Birchmore had joined what's called an explorers club. It's kids in high school or even younger that want to be cops. And that's where they began grooming her. And he had sex with her. He started grooming her when she was 14 when she joined that program and had sex with her when she was 15. So he didn't rape her. It was statutory rape because she was underage but willing. In late December of that year, state investigators began to focus on whether the text showed Farwell could instead be charged with larceny, stealing from the taxpayers, essentially for meeting Birchmore for sex while he was on the clock. So what this does seem to suggest, but we really need a more fuller story here, is that the state police were trying to get him on something. They knew something stunk here, so they weren't trying to protect him. They were trying to get him on something. So the question will be is why they weren't able to. A spokesman for State Attorney General Andrea Campbell says that her office's white-collar crime section has a case open, suggesting the larceny investigation is still being pursued. I mean, that seems like a strange thing. You're going to get larceny because he had sex in his cruiser while he was on duty. That's a little weak. Let me take a sip of beer. How aggressively did state authorities investigate Birchmore's death as a possible murder? It's hard to say. I'm reading from the article. Investigating agencies have withheld key records on the grounds that the matter is still open. And the leaders of those agencies, Morrissey, Dr. Mindy Hull, who was the chief medical examiner, and Colonel Jeffrey Noble, the current head of the state police, all declined to be interviewed. But a globe analysis of the voluminous investigative record obtained through dozens of public records requests has revealed a number of missed clues, such as the broken necklace, along with red flags passed over. I mean, it is kind of stunning to me that they respond to a crime scene or a death scene and they don't find a broken necklace on the floor. It's sloppy. It seems sloppy to me. Is that unfair? I don't know. But none of this on its own was proof of murder, but together they formed a body of evidence that experts they consulted, like professors and stuff, should have pushed authorities to fundamentally reconsider their suicide theory. Should Farwell be convicted in federal court of killing Birchmore, he has pleaded not guilty. Morrissey will certainly, and I don't believe he's charged with murder, because usually the feds don't. Murder is a state crime. I forget what he was charged with. Obstruction, conspiracy to commit murder. Maybe I don't know. It was something slightly different. Morrissey will certainly. So if he's convicted, Morrissey will certainly face tough questions about how his office let him walk free for so long, and he should. He should. And if Morrissey's investigation failed Birchmore, a role may have been played by the confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new evidence as reinforcing an initial impression. Experts say investigations of apparent suicides are also often bedeviled by a kind of circular logic. She took her own life, so she was clearly struggling. She was struggling, so clearly she took her own life. It's apparent from records that state investigators heard and saw evidence that encouraged them to believe that Birchmore was troubled. And so that's why they were quicker to buy into the narrative that it was a suicide. And then the Globe says what looks like symptoms of mental illness are also signs of abuse. The first impression of suicide traveled fast. Starting around 11 a.m. on February 4th, Canton police officers told the detective that Birchmore had hanged herself. Well, that's what it looked like. An officer made a call to Shiana Isabel, a school resource office in Stoughton, who'd known Birchmore for years. She told him the young woman had struggled after the deaths of her mother and grandmother. So Sandra's mother and grandmother died when she had been raised by her mother and grandmother. I don't think there were any male figures in her life, and tragically, her mother and grandmother died when she was a senior in high school. According to Canton police, she also had a history of claiming she was pregnant when she actually was not. Don't know if that's confirmed. The officers would hear other stories about how Birchmore could exaggerate or outright lie. This time, she was telling the truth. She had told friends she'd suffered at least one miscarriage, so she was considered high risk, but her weekly blood test suggested a healthy pregnancy. Officers also met the building's property manager to review security video. And the snippets from the day of the snowstorm show Birchmore picking up food on the phone, and the last time they saw her coming in with a snow brush. I've played that on this channel. And she was wearing at that time the same clothes they would find her in, which showed she was killed that day. Soon, other police, including Dunn, were in Birchmore's apartment recording impressions of their reports. Dunn noted Birchmore's messiness in some detail, clutter on every surface, a rug that looked like it hadn't been vacuumed for a while, medications and trash on the counter. So did that make it harder to find the necklace? Maybe. There was no sign of a struggle, according to Dunn's report. No scuff marks or indentations on the wall, no drag marks on the floor. Birchmore's body showed no defensive wounds. Now, this was insidious because I read out the, it wasn't the indictment, but it was, I think it was, I forget what the document was, but it was detailed like the charging document. And what the feds detailed was that this guy him and Sandra had been play acting for years with fantasies that involved rape and also strangulation. So she probably thought he was just enacting one of their usual fantasies when, in matter of fact, he was intending to kill her. So if she fought back, by the time she decided to, it was really too late. And he was a big guy, and she's a small girl. So he noticed no bruising, swelling, or external trauma, nor any markings that would show she was trying to loosen the strap around her neck. But again, that strap was put on afterwards. Trooper Kevin Tufts began to prepare a standard form for the medical examiner. Next to the field labeled homicide, he filled in no. Next to the possible manner of death, he wrote suicide. After police left that day, the medical examiner's staff took Birchmore's body away. Something wasn't sitting right with the property manager, so he decided to go back and look at the security footage again. Thank God he did, and you'll see this below. This time, she spotted a man she didn't recognize. He entered the lobby, a tall man wearing a COVID mask. That's him leaving. That's Farwell leaving right after he's killed. You can tell he's in a hurry. Now, this is during COVID, so he kind of has that excuse for wearing a mask. But we were told last year by people, there he is there. I mean, look how covered up he is. I mean, look how shady this is. I can expand this for you guys. So we were told that this guy, during the pandemic, was one of those guys that refused to wear a mask and was always getting in trouble for it. And so the Stoughton police officers themselves found this very suspicious that he did this. But he's not only he's got a hood on. Now it is snowing out, right? You can see snow on it. So unfortunately, it does give that excuse, but still, I really don't know any guys that would walk in. As a guy, I can tell you, if you had your hood on at all, you'd shake that off as soon as you got inside the door. And this guy's hurrying to the elevator, and he's clearly trying to avoid the camera. And I was shocked when I saw this. I was a little over a year ago. I was stunned to see it. And so that's him as he's on his way to kill this poor girl. And in a moment, you'll see him leave. And that's him leaving. So this was, thank God that this building manager had the determination to keep looking through, and she found that. So she alerted investigators. Now, somehow they identified him as Matthew Farwell. A woman had called the complex's emergency line saying that Birchmore had told her that her police officer boyfriend wanted her to get an abortion or he would take care of the problem himself. So this was around February 5th, and it would be months before the medical examiner would finally make her determination of suicide. So at the office of the chief medical examiner in Boston, pathologist Maria del Mar Capo Martinez was conducting an autopsy on Birchmore's body. The troopers arrived at the East Elementary School where she worked to interview her colleagues. And that's where they first learned of Matthew Farwell, because an aunt had told the principal about it. Dunn repeatedly asked, this trooper in charge, the same question as the interviewed coworkers. Did Birchmore ever say she was afraid somebody would hurt her? And again, he heard no. So this, again, if Dunn was somehow corruptly trying to protect the killer, then why would he be in his investigation asking if somebody was afraid to hurt her? I don't think he would. But he kept hearing no. But he was asking that question. So meanwhile, it was up to Dr. Martinez to determine the cause of death. Detectives routinely attend autopsies amid death investigations, but no one from the Norfolk County DA came to the medical examiner's office that day. And so Martinez was still looking more closely at Birchmore's case than is typical for a suspected suicide. The office of the chief medical examiner usually doesn't perform autopsies in such cases. Over the last decade, pathologists did them, and only 1 in 4 of the nearly 6,000 deaths they deemed suicides, according to data from the State Department of Public Health. In death-judged suicidal hangings, so in suicidal hangings, autopsies were performed in only about 1 in 7 cases. So this is also interesting, too. In Stoughton, Chief McNamara ordered her second-in-command, Brian Holmes, to launch an internal affairs investigation. One of her detectives had apparently been having a sexual relationship with a woman, a former explorer, who was pregnant and now dead. Holmes will be given wide latitude and significant resources. So again, they weren't trying to cover it up either. And that woman there is the police chief. She gave him as long as he needed to do it right. He would end up investigating for 19 months before releasing a report that would change everything. Now, a question I would have is why he's doing this on his own, and why this is not done working more closely with the troopers. But by Saturday afternoon, troopers Fanning and Dunn were ready to speak with Farwell. They'd heard he'd been having sex with Birchmore, and that her pregnancy was a problem for him. By then, they may also have suspected he was the man on the security video the last night that she was seen alive. They met Farwell around 3 p.m. in a Stoughton Elementary School parking lot. The discussion was not recorded. It was also apparently collegial. Throughout Fanning's 2.5-page written summary, he refers to Farwell as Matt. Well, I think they're making a big deal about that, but that's really nothing. Farwell said he'd known Birchmore since her days as an explorer. She'd had a troubled life, and he felt bad for her. He admitted to having sex with her, but said it started in early 2020 when she was 22. So he told some lies here, but as you can see from they should have known from the messages these were lies. And they had the same messages. So he said that she'd been Section 12, put into custody a couple of times, involuntarily for mental illness. That was an exaggeration. The FBI later determined that it was only once. That she'd had multiple partners stuck with Fanning, who recorded that both in his report on the Farwell interview and months later in a memo to a supervisor about examining Birchmore's laptop. It appeared that Sandra had sexual relationships with other men in the months leading up to her death. There were no threats of harm by any of these individuals, including Matt. As to the night he last saw her, Farwell told Trooper Dunn and Fanning that he'd gone to her apartment to end the relationship, to tell Birchmore she was crazy and the baby wasn't his. They'd had a pretty nasty argument. She called him a dick, he said, but she was not despondent. He said she was standing in the kitchen when he left. But we'll see that doesn't match the data on that phone. A married police officer's admission that he'd been having sex with a woman he met when she was a child should have been an immediate red flag, says Tom Nolan, who is with the Boston Police Department for 27 years and now teaches criminal justice at Suffolk University. That would seem so. There are limits to how much courtesy should be extended to a fellow officer. This guy is creeping around the scene at the time she died. Why aren't we looking at him? Nolan says. I mean, a good, hard look, not a conversation in the school parking lot that's not even recorded. I can't, look, I agree. I agree 100%, 1,000%. This is just bad policing. It's bad policing. But we're going to fire Proctor from insensitive remarks, but we're not going to do anything when it's bad policing. All right. The following week, Trooper Dunn was following up on leads, interviewing people who called the DA's office after Perozzi's post on Facebook. So they'd had some arguments. Let me go back this up for a little bit. By this point, investigators were learning things that Fanning thought the medical examiner should know. On the morning of Tuesday, February 9th, he emailed the pathologist's office hoping to speak to Dr. Martinez. Someone in the office suggested they talk Friday. Is there any way we can do this early in the week? There are some issues that I'd like the doctor to know before then. They made plans to talk, but authorities have declined to say what Fanning's news was, citing the pending case. A couple of hours later, Farwell came into the Norfolk DA's office to turn over his personal phone at the trooper's request so they could download data from it. That's called an extraction. Farwell told them he deleted messages from Birchmore, but signed the consent form. So that meant they could look through his phone and, in theory, get messages, even the ones he deleted. Later that day, Farwell apparently had second thoughts about cooperating using his department-issued phone. He made 2 Google searches, according to the federal prosecutors. The first, he wrote and then deleted, can deleted messages be recovered by Celebrate? So, the feds had this. Why didn't the state police have this? If they did, why didn't they start digging harder, realizing that something was going on? And the other thing that he searched was, can you revoke consent in Massachusetts? And he deleted that question too. So the cousin there, Perosi, wanted Fanning to get a DNA sample from Farwell and have it tested to see if the baby belonged to him. The trooper seemed reluctant to do so. Farwell had already admitted to having sex with Birchmore. She recalls him saying, so what would a DNA link prove? Well, and she says it proves he's a liar, and he could be lying about other things. But that wasn't persuasive to Fanning. As it happened, the answer to Farwell's query about deleted messages was yes. Deleted messages, like Google searches, could indeed be recovered, though it would take some luck. Perosi recalls, again, that's the cousin, that a trooper Dunn saying that they were having trouble unlocking Birchmore's iPhone. She recommended the trooper try her laptop, explaining that the messages could also be found there. She was right. Records suggest that they were able to crack the security on the MacBook pretty easy. And it turned out this is funkily written here, but her messages were being stored there. It says, for a long time, Farwell had warned Birchmore to erase their most troubling exchanges. The FBI alleged much later in the affidavit, after one conversation in which he said he wanted her to pretend he was raping her, he instructed her to clear out his text. Their messages had, in fact, been syncing automatically to Birchmore's MacBook, something that certainly Farwell didn't know about and probably not Birchmore either, or she may have. Investigators eventually recovered nearly 33,000 messages between them in the 14 months before her death. Their texts were in a massive data file, one investigator described as overwhelming and all over the map. The conversations were so jumbled it was hard to tell who was talking to whom. Fanning and others spent weeks reviewing them all, looking for evidence of criminal conduct related to Birchmore's death. One thing they were able to make sense of was conversations where the two first talked about having sex in April of 2013 when she was 15. So they did have the messages, and they were able to find enough to know that he was lying, and they weren't able enough to find to know that he had committed serious crimes. They were looking. This is not a cover-up, but this does seem to be a case where either there's an issue of competency, or it is even more likely there's just an issue of time and resources, and you just don't seem to have enough troopers assigned to this unit where they could spend the hundreds and hundreds of hours needed to make sense of those messages. And that's something the FBI was obviously able to do. But this also suggests a problem could be the lack of cooperation between the U.S. Attorney's Office and the state police, or at least the Norfolk County, not the state police, but the Norfolk County DA's office. That seems to be a problem here, right? But again, we don't know. I'm not trying to. You're trying to get to the facts of what happened here, and I don't know. And you're trying to look at all the evidence. I think that's worth looking into, and that's where the investigation has to go. Records show that troopers did, in fact, seek Farwell's DNA shortly after Birchmell's death. So, again, this already contradicts something that was said earlier. The cousin didn't realize, but they did try to get the DNA, probably before she'd even asked. But that's just not something that they told her. So this is why we have to be so careful following these stories, not to just jump on the little thing that we hear and we want to seize on, especially if it fits a narrative that we already want. We already want to think the police are corrupt and this was a cover-up. So you just, instead of parsing things, you just jump on things that fit that narrative. So it says they did try to get it if they had obtained it. So I don't know why they couldn't. They could have compared it with samples from Birchmore's clothing, her fetus, and the ligature around her neck, for example. But by March 8th, Farwell was done cooperating with the police. He refused to provide a DNA sample or submit to another interview with a polygraph test. Those measures were far outside the norm for a mere witness, his attorney wrote. Well, we can skip that part. His attorney's naturally going to say he's innocent. Troopers had, but see, this is the thing. Troopers had other ways of getting a DNA sample, pursuing it surreptitiously or via a judge's order. But it appears they just didn't bother. They dropped the effort. It's just a shame when you look at this to see that had they been able to work with the U.S. Attorney's Office, with the FBI, perhaps they could have got this done. But one of the things that I've learned from talking to people that know how the U.S. Attorney's Office works is that it tends to be, it's kind of a headline seeker. And so the way it was described to me is that a DA's office is reactive. They're taking the cases they're required to solve. The U.S. Attorney's Office is proactive. They're deciding what cases they wish to pursue. Well, they're not obligated because they're not obligated to pursue any of these, right? Well, what do they wish to pursue? They wish to pursue the cases that are getting headlines. And so we'll see from this that the U.S. Attorney's Office didn't begin their investigation into this until it says late in 2023. So that's more than a year after they began looking into Karen Read. So there's no, that theory on the Karen Read predication is out. But so why do they wait so long? Well, at that point, they probably started seeing podcasts and series and stuff like that on this case. In fact, I'm sure it had nothing to do with us, but we did a story on this on our channel. It sounds like right before they launched this case, this investigation. Again, I'm sure they weren't paying attention to us, though. I'm not being facetious. I'm sure they weren't. But so why didn't they go after that DNA? And like I said, why the feds didn't help them? Well, until this was generating headlines, it wasn't as interesting to them. So it is often difficult to distinguish between self-hanging and strangulation via autopsy alone. Everybody's heard about the hyoid bone, which is when it's broken in women, because women that don't weigh that much, that's a sign of strangulation. And hers was broken. But there's a lot of debate about the relevance of that. It was a long time before these pivotal photographs from Birchmore's apartment made it to the Massachusetts medical examiner Internal emails show. Dr. Martinez did not request them until May 1st, 2021, 3 months after Birchmore was found dead, and just days before she made her determination. So again, this also highlights the fact that when medical examiners are doing an autopsy, we falsely think that what happens is they are able to just lock themselves in a room and cut open the body and do all this testing and then know what the cause of death is. That's not real world. In the real world, they actually have to know more about the crime scene. They need more clues. It's not that easy to just look at it and know. So this is why the troopers investigating it usually are working with them to give them information. So for instance, in the case of John O'Keefe, you had signs of hypothermia in the hemorrhaging of the stomach and maybe the pancreas, I forget. And what Dr. Scorti-Bello explained is that is known to be associated with hypothermia, but it's not even known what the cause is of that. So it could be from other things. So seeing hemorrhaging in the stomach and in the pancreas, that could be a sign of hypothermia, but it could be a sign of something else. So that's why it's so important for the police to explain the circumstances of how the body was found. So in the case of John O'Keefe, they explained that his body temperature was 81 degrees when he was found, and he was lying outside covered in snow and wearing light clothing. On May 21st, so you get this is a long time after Birchmore's death. It's 3 months after. They finally determined, the medical examiner, that the cause of death was asphyxia by hanging. Manner of death, suicide. And it says here too, if Morrissey's office was ever seriously considering a murder charge, that suicide determination would be an obstacle to building a case, because now it becomes harder to get probable cause to get certain information. But the ruling was in line with how troopers saw the case as well. In a 2023 affidavit describing Birchmore's death as a suicide, Fanning noted the medical examiner's findings as well as physical evidence from the scene, Birchmore's mental health history, including her past suicidal ideations, which resulted in involuntary commitment to a health facility. So after the medical examiner's ruling, Morrissey's investigation into Birchmore, into her death, began to focus on the suspected larceny. So they were trying to get him on something. They knew this was a disgusting, dirty cop. So they weren't trying to protect him. They just weren't sure how to get this done, how to get him on, and what to get him on. Perosi recalls Fanning assuring her they were still trying to hold Farwell accountable somehow. She was appalled. It was just desperate, she says now, and not enough. I don't blame her. Again, I'm not accusing anybody of wrongdoing. But here's a woman that was murdered, had a lot of signs of it, and they were ruling it a suicide. So that spring, Stoughton Deputy Police Chief Brian Holmes had been building a team for his internal affairs investigation. He'd hired 2 private detectives and an IT expert, all retired state troopers, to help him conduct interviews and analyze phone data. They would dig deep, but their scope was limited. Holmes' job was not to investigate a possible crime, but to instead answer a question. Had Matthew Farwell violated the police department's rules and regulations? Because remember, he was working still as a cop at this time. Before he was done, he would find himself asking the same about William Farwell and Robert Devine. So Devine was a supervisor and William was his twin brother. Take a sip. We're almost through this article, I promise this. I know, putting you guys to sleep. There's a value in that, right? Getting to put people to sleep. I know a lot of people have said they like to listen to me talk about this stuff because it puts them to sleep. And then they promise me that they wake up in the morning and listen to what they missed. So on September 30th, 8 months after the body was found, troopers provided Holmes with texts, 50,000 pages of jumbled conversations. Holmes and his team set about examining them closely. So the state police sounds like they had all this stuff. They gave up on trying to make sense of it, but they turned it over to Holmes, the deputy chief for Stoughton. He was required to share any findings relevant to the state police investigation, which took precedence, and so was in frequent touch with Fanning. Before too long, they got a better organized version of the messages, which made it easier to tell whom Birchmore was texting. William had already told state police he had sexual encounters with Birchmore. That's the brother. And she told him she was pregnant with his brother's baby. The internal affairs investigators eventually found William and Birchmore had been exchanging photos and videos of a very sexually graphic nature. Again, that's the brother. Wow, he was working because he's also a cop. According to their report, William repeatedly encouraged her to secretly record her sexual encounters with others and then send them to him, a crime in Massachusetts. He also sent her images and videos of him having sex with believed to be his spouse. They also saw evidence in Facebook messages to suggest that Devine, this was the supervisor at that original Explorers program. So just, these predators that we put into these positions or that work their way into these positions. He was also a school resource officer. Now he's a lawyer in Massachusetts. And he was seeking sex with her by 2020. By next spring, they had a lot of evidence against both Farwell's and Devine, and the men seemed to sense it. Matthew Farwell remained on paid leave, but he was already beginning a new career, earning a commercial driver's license and starting his own trucking business. He resigned from the Stoughton police right before Holmes was set to interview him, so he was avoiding the interviews. A few days later, after a story in the Globe revealed the connection between Matthew Farwell and Birchmore, Devine and William Farwell were also placed on paid leave. So all three of these guys that were grooming these underage girls worked for the very small police department of Stoughton. So, look, I mean, it unfairly smears all the police that work for these many police departments across the state and across the country that don't do stuff like this. And they're mad about it too. But still, that's why nobody ever can get the benefit of the doubt in any of these cases, including police. So William Farwell resigned before he could be interviewed. He sold his house and moved to Maryland. He was sworn in as a transportation security administrative agent in Baltimore. Devine admitted to flirting with an explorer in his program, though her name is redacted. And I may know who that person is. But he said he didn't know about the Farwell brothers impersonating police officers. So I didn't even catch that in the story. But apparently the Farwell brothers, as teenagers, had been impersonating police officers. I don't know what that part of the story is. So Devine said he'd known Birchmore and about her difficult home life since she was a teen. So just all the reasons to exploit and take advantage of these young girls, or in this case, Sandra, I don't know about the other ones, but had no male figures in her life. And then she loses her mother and a grandmother. He knew about this and didn't give a shit. Continuing to target her for sex. Disgusting. And this guy has not faced any charges and probably won't. It's disgusting. I wish we still had tar and feathering in this state. And Devine had been communicating under the name Marty Riggs. That's the character from Lethal Weapon, the Mel Gibson character. So he had been communicating with her using that name. These guys were eventually lost their licenses to be police officers. In late 2023, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts began looking at the case. The U.S. Attorney declined to comment for this story. FBI agents combed through the same evidence. FBI agents combed through the same evidence state troopers had collected. In the texts, they found messages displaying Matthew Farwell's penchant for role-playing, rape, and incest fantasies, and for choking Birchmore during sex. In his eye, they saw memes where the punchlines were about violence against women. So possibly that's the iCloud stuff might be something the state police didn't have. They also found reasons to interview people that the other investigators hadn't. Among them was the Stoughton police employee who took the call when Birchmore's friend let slip that Farwell was having sex with Birchmore. That employee told agents that Farwell had become uncharacteristically angry and ordered his colleague not to speak of it to anyone. A pivotal moment, according to the FBI affidavit. Morrissey's office had no records of that, or says they have no records of that. Federal prosecutors also said the text showed, again, these are texts that they did have, that the state did have, that Farwell had lied repeatedly to investigators. He claimed he only had sex with Birchmore 2 or 3 times in the past year or so, but they found evidence suggesting it was at least 10 times. So as I had gone over before, what was going on was this girl was childlike in many ways, never really grew up, and all she wanted to do was to be a cop. But at some point, as she realized that that wasn't going to happen, and Farwell was married, had kids, his wife was pregnant again, she decided that what she wanted from him was a baby. Again, she constructed, it doesn't say this in this article, but she constructed a letter to be sent to his wife, and she was also threatening to contact where he worked, the police, and say that he had sex with her when she was underage. So this would have destroyed his professional career. It would have resulted in charges against him, and it would have destroyed his marriage. She was threatening to do all those things if he didn't give her the baby. So he did agree. So she had sex with her, and she did get pregnant. She had implied initially that that would be all she wanted, but now that she realized she had some leverage over him, she started making more demands. She wanted to have his name, and it was clear that she was going to keep making more demands. And so he made a decision clearly that the only way eventually it was going to go bad, and he had no choice in his mind but to do what he did. Now, that's in no way excusing it at all. None of it is excusable. None of it. I'm just trying to explain that this is what's in the FBI files, that's what's happened. It's like tragic reading it because you're like, oh God, this girl has no idea what's coming. She has no idea the pressure that she's putting on this guy that already has fantasies about murder. You're playing with fire in the worst possible way. So a few weeks before he started planning it, she even suspected something funny was going on. And he came over and did it. So just a very sad and tragic story. This girl, used, manipulated, groomed since she was 14, had no father figures in her life, had the misfortune of the people that were raising her, mom and a grandmother, dying when she was in high school. This girl just had every bit of bad luck that you could have. She had it. And there were people there waiting to exploit that and take advantage of it. A lot of people. And they wore badges. And they did. In terms of what happened, why this case wasn't solved, that needs to be investigated. And articles like this is a good start. But there's a range of possibilities here. And cover up does not seem to be one of them. So we should be careful about jumping to conclusions just because it fits a narrative. There's evidence that they knew something was fishy, but for some reason they were not able to get the job done. And so we need to get to the bottom of that. Why? Did they not have the resources? Did somebody say, look, you got no more time to put into this case. You can't get any more with it. I don't know. Need to find out. Lisa says, Kevin, hope you have a very Merry Christmas. You too, Lisa. Thank you very much and good to see you. And she commends Thomas Fleming for being very patient, which he is. Usually. So Lana Del Grey, thank you. Keep it real also. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Very much appreciate it. And Merry Christmas to you. And no, Zigzag, man, that's very generous. Thank you very much. Merry Christmas to you. Wish I could buy you a beer with it or whatever it is your drink of choice. And all kinds of music chick. Thank you very much. And she says, thank you for all that you do and for showing up for us time and time again. Merry Christmas to you and yours. Take good care of yourself. And I do really appreciate that. Obviously, I appreciate the donation, but I mean the kind words. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And the dude abides. Here should be some wisdom. The dude says, correct a fool, he will hate you. Correct a wise man, he will appreciate you. May all my peeps abide and enjoy the holiday. Yes, and that definitely applies to me. I make mistakes. People correct me. I appreciate it. Absolutely. So thank you very much. And I have a lot of this beer left. It's so hard to drink when you're the only one on the air talking. So Tom and Joe, take it away and chat for a moment. Keep them entertained so I can. The Birchmore case is definitely going to trial. There's a lot of interesting things to see. I want to see if the state brings charges. The state charges it with murder. So turn the lights down a little bit. That's one thing I'd like to see. But we need to get to the bottom of what went wrong with this case. And this is something, obviously, maybe police need to make a policy of looking more closely at suicides, which is difficult because there's a lot of suicides. Thank you, Layla. Cheers to you too. Francesca, Merry Christmas. Hopefully you guys all got to have a sip. This beer is called a Pilsner. And I used to drink a cheap Pilsner beer a lot down the bar called Miller High Life. The champagne of beers. This might even be made by Bud, but it's a better version, but it's a Pilsner. I enjoy Pilsner beers. Lisa, thank you very much. Too kind. You don't have to, but thank you very much. I appreciate it. So Jay says, would they try, if it's a hung jury again, would they try a third trial? They've said they will. They said they'll try it as many times as they take. But we're already seeing the defense trying to put out this campaign of trying to say it's too expensive. And they got the Globe on board. And you may have a change of office, too, if Morrissey gets primaried and he gets voted out. So it may come down to what the new DA thinks. But here's the thing. You're going to, at the very most that Karen can hope for here is one or two Free Karen readers or turtle riders getting through, or just somebody not being for some reason convinced. Now, look, in the last trial, which was deeply flawed, a deeply flawed presentation by the prosecution, they still got 9 votes for guilty. So this time they're going to do a much, much, much better job. They're going to have independent experts that come in and explain things that weren't explained last time. And assuming that is all done well, you're going to do much better than 9. But you need 12. And if you get somebody that goes on to this jury, and there were people that went on to the last jury, I know this for a fact, that did not do their duty because they came in with an opinion and they didn't tell the truth. And they lied every day or at least one that raised her hand every day and said, I have not followed this in the media. Now, she was dismissed. So we can't blame anything that happened on the final verdict for her. And I don't blame them. I think the jurors, the final 12, did a good job, however they voted. I think they were diligent and did a good job. So artworks too. Thank you very much. Merry Christmas, Kevin. Thank you for your always thoughtful and balanced analysis. I guess it wasn't balanced enough for Kristen, who was here earlier. Sorry about that, but give us another chance, Kristen. Reach out. If you're really interested in the truth, we can get you a lot of things that no one else will get you. I don't want to say no one. There's a few other people covering this case. Obviously, Kate, but Kate, I never know when she's doing a show. It's somewhat irregular. Thank you very much, Wicked Uma. I don't know. Is Antiquated Rogue still covering this case? I haven't talked to him. I think it's been a while since he's done a show, right? And I don't think Karen McCormick's been doing too many shows. And then there's Boundless Millennial, but he doesn't do lives. He does very entertaining and effective videos that he takes time to make. Where's our Celtics fans there? How'd the Celtics do tonight? Did they avenge the Bulls? Zigzag, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Says, keep up the great work. Take a stretch. Yeah, I got to find a way to do this standing. It'd be much better. Yeah, it's, she says Joe says we need more truth-speaking YouTubers. So Court TV, in my caught this morning, they had recently done a show. So Richard Allen in Delphi was sentenced to 130 years. And so they had on this guy, lawyer, YouTuber kind of thing. Oh, God, reporter. Shit, I can't remember his name at the moment. But he's always been kind of grifting on the conspiracy idea in that case. And he brought in, so on Vinnie Politan was this guy, as well as a woman who was a friend of the families, I guess, but a friend of the Richard Allen families, was arguably one of the poorest spoken people I've ever seen. She was just gibberishing up there. It was terrible. But they're trying to say that Richard Allen is innocent and that it was indeed an Odinist cult that killed Abby and Libby. It's absurd. And I posted on that YouTube thing underneath. I said, no, Richard Allen put his own words, put him at that bridge moments before Abby and Libby arrived. Now, that alone should tell anybody what happened here. And man, I got a flood of comments of everybody saying, you don't know what you're talking about. Richard Allen was innocent. So this is what goes on now in the true crime world, is that there's just something in the water. I don't know if people can't process evidence, don't want to process evidence. Oh, it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating. Someone asked when we're going to do the get together or something like that. I just don't know how to, because so somebody had mentioned a place that we could do it where there's a friendly bartender, and so no one else will get in, but they'll still be outside taking pictures. And this is the thing, which doesn't bother me, but most of the people that would want to meet with us don't want their picture flashed all over the internet showing what side they're on. Celtics smoked him. All right, good. Thanks, dude. So that's the problem. I don't know how to do a get together where people can remain anonymous. If they're willing to take the chance of coming out and having a drink with us, and willing to take that chance of being filmed or being pictured as they leave or as they get there, that's one thing. But yes, Richard Allen definitely killed those girls. But unfortunately, in today's day and age, is people going to buy into a conspiracy theory, and there's nothing we can do. D-Dev says, I haven't seen anything to suggest that the next trial will have a different outcome than the first. Many people are obviously going to have a very tough time accepting how flawed this case remains. It's not flawed at all, D-Dev. I don't want to again go over it here because people get sick of hearing it. But the essential problem with the trial is that Adam Lally overestimated what the value of Karen Reed's statements at the scene saying, I hit him. He overestimated that because jurors were going to look at that and say, we don't have a recording of her saying it, so we don't know if she was asking the question. Did she say it? Was she still drunk? Was she just in shock? Don't know what she meant, but they know that she's not saying it now because she's pleading innocent. So the jurors are not going to factor that in very much, if at all. And if you even have just some jurors that have an argument with it, they're just going to table it and put it aside. That's how it works. When you have 12 people trying to get to a decision, they have to focus on the things that they all agree on. And if some of them don't agree about what Karen meant at the scene when she said, I hit him, or whether she actually said it, then they're going to dismiss that. But they focused on that. They utterly neglected trying to explain John's injuries or lack of injuries. But the big thing for me is they were sitting on this bulletproof data that they did present to the jury, but in a way that no jury could ever figure it out. So they had the vehicle data, but unfortunately it didn't have timestamps. Now, Trooper Paul is the one who had the vehicle data. Trooper Garino is the one who had John's phone data. Now, because of that phone data, we can attach timestamps to within seconds to the events on that vehicle data. So Karen and John are driving to Fairview Street, and when they're about a mile away, they're lost. They don't know how to get there. So they call Jen McCabe for the directions for the address, and John punches the address into Waze. So Waze guides them there. They're going down Cedar Crest Street. They need to take a left to get onto Fairview. It's dark. Maybe they're arguing. They missed a turn. And then obviously Waze starts making all kinds of noise saying you missed your turn. So they did a 3-point turn on Cedar Crest. Now, because of the sharpness of that turn where she hit the gas more than 30% while it was in reverse, that created that triggered the creation of an event in the data. That event does not come with a timestamp. It may with the new data, but as of last trial, it did not come with a timestamp. However, we know what time they missed the turn onto Fairview, and we know what time they made the turn after she turned around. So you can put her 3-point turn in the middle of that. So we know within say plus 4 or 5 seconds exactly what time they made that 3-point turn. Well, 8 minutes and 8 seconds after that turn is another event triggered in the data because she's going in reverse at 24 miles an hour for several seconds. And 8 minutes, so that event begins 8 minutes and 4 seconds after the 3-point turn. But 4 seconds after that event begins is when John is struck. And you got the telltale signs of a pedestrian strike in the data. So that means that 8 minutes and 8 seconds after the 3-point turn is when John O'Keefe was struck. Now, even if they get no new data, we should be able to get we know within several seconds of when that was, but we should get more accurate data because Trooper Garino has all the GPS points. So based on the GPS, we should actually know within a second or two exactly when they did that 3-point turn. But they weren't thinking about this because Trooper Garino was not trying to correlate with the vehicle data. He didn't have the vehicle data. Trooper Paul was not trying to coordinate with the phone data because he didn't have it. They were unaware of it. So no expert witness, no witness presented the jury with that correlation. Now, Adam Lally, in the closing arguments, tried to a little bit, but he ends up saying that the accident took place around 12:31, but in the opening statements, he amazingly said that it took place at 12:35. So I guess the jury wasn't supposed to notice that, right? So those are all mistakes that will be corrected in the second trial. In the second trial, you will have an independent expert that will sit there in front of the jury and correlate that data. And they'll do it with visual displays, I presume, that really shows it. And if you can imagine how 9 jurors were convinced by the last trial that they didn't do that, with this one, when they do that, my God, it's going to be extremely convincing. You say you haven't seen it, but how could you possibly know? All right. He says, and Kevin, that's really my point. It was a very flawed case. The presentation was flawed, not the evidence. And so far, I haven't seen them tighten it up or do anything different. But how could you? We haven't had a trial yet. Prosecutor Brennan hasn't had any opportunity to do any of that. So how would you actually know? And the defense will still have the dog lady, yes. But now the prosecution had an option last time to bring on a really good dog bite expert, and they didn't want to pay for it. It was going to cost $22,000. They're not taking that chance this time. They're going to have it. And that, as far as the ARCA guys, well, we'll see. I think there's a very good chance the ARCA guys are going to come on and say something very different now, because presumably they've been sent the text stream data. So, but the ARCA, you saw from the interviews with the jurors, the ARCA guys didn't impact the jurors. Their arguments were not a factor with them. Both the interviewed jurors that voted guilty and the ones that voted for acquittal, neither one of them mentioned the ARCA guys. It wasn't important to them. But there will be no, and even if it's the ARCA guys, as good, as qualified as they are, they're still trying to interpret vague things like injuries and position of the body and damage. It's tricky. And they didn't rule out that John couldn't have been hit by a car. They just didn't seem to think it was likely. But let's balance that off against the actual data, the vehicle data correlated with the phone data that is bulletproof. And you just have to present it to the jury by one witness who puts it all together before the prosecution rests. I mean, doing it in the closing arguments is too late. If the defense begins their case and the prosecution hasn't fully convinced him, it's over. So ARCA, and I'll answer one more from DDev, but I don't want to be unfair to other people. I have no reason. I have never accused the ARCA guys of perjury or of incompetence. What I have said, what I have questioned is their credibility. Now, for me, for accident reconstructionists, which is what they are, their competency is not in question. Their qualifications are there. It's what their company does. For them to do an accident reconstruction without getting the vehicle data is very much like a medical examiner doing an autopsy without the body. Not only without the body, or without even photos of the body. That is a real sign right there that these guys were not interested in the truth. They were interested in making their client, the U.S. attorney, happy. They understood that the U.S. attorney wanted to create doubt about the state's case. We don't know why they did. They didn't know why. But they're able to get that dog whistle because that's what they were hired to do. But the fact that they did not ask for the text stream data is really telling. I've showed on this channel here, there's an article on the ARCA's website, published a year before John's death, that says they are experts in text stream. And that text, I've gone over it several times on the channel, and that text stream data is something that is special to Lexus Toyota that often recovers data that the black box didn't. They were aware of that. But yet they didn't say to the U.S. attorney, hey, is there any black box? Is there any text stream data? They didn't say that. But now they know, right? They didn't. So again, they didn't want to know back then. They didn't ask. Don't ask. Don't ask, don't tell, right? You don't want if you don't want the question answered, don't ask it. And that's why they didn't ask it. So that alone was evidence that they were not trying to get to the truth. They were trying to please their client, which is really, really different. Heisenberg points out that the Glarer, so the Glarer is at war, it seems, with Mike Crawford, otherwise known as Young Jelly. I don't know why. I don't care. But, I mean, it's interesting to see. Look, nobody... I've tried to explain this to Young Jelly before. Nobody respects you on either side, Mike, because you're a coward. And I'm not trying to say that to be smearing somebody. Young Jelly came out grifting on this case, like all the other ones, never asking questions, just all conspiracy, buddying up with Turtle Boy, someone who is politically the opposite of him, all to get views. But then one day, late December, he had gone silent for a couple of weeks. And suddenly, I wake up that morning and I get a friend request from Mike Crawford. I'm like, what is going on? No message, but a friend request. I'm like, what is going on here? So I tuned into his show for the first time and the last time. Well, I watched maybe 15 minutes on an episode when he had on that guy, Peter Murphy, the retired Canton police officer. That's the only time I've watched him. People sometimes send me a clip. I might see a clip, but when I watched that show last December, which he has deleted, he came across as a reasonable guy. He said, from now on, I am going to cover this case differently. I'm going to try to respect and seek answers from both sides. And I'm going to cover it that way right up to and through the trial. He sounded like a reasonable guy. He sounded like a guy that had some regrets for not having covered it that way. Whatever the reason, he did that. And he said, and I want to apologize to Kevin Lenahan for all the mean things or whatever I've said about him. I hadn't heard any of them, but he's like, but I will say the one thing that I don't like about Kevin is he talks about there being a mindless mob. As he was saying that, I'm watching, the mindless mob was actually in his chat. Hundreds of them, all the turtle people were there calling him a coward and calling him this and that. And all of a sudden he looks down and he sees it. And he's like, oh, he's like, you people are crazy. He realized in that moment there was a mindless mob. But within minutes, he went back to trying to say, well, don't worry, guys. I still think Karen Reed is innocent. And he started trying to cover it from that way. But then the damage is already done. He had made hundreds of Turtle Boy people hate him and Free Karen Reed people hate him. So then Turtle Boy was in jail at that time. And the next day, a message is leaked out by the Pitbull or somebody who had managed to get listed as an attorney on his blog, where he threatens. He says, look, he goes, there'll be no more wavering. And I don't remember, I don't have the quote in front of me, but he's like, no more wavering. This is what he's always said to me. No more asking questions. No more both sidesism. You're only allowed to discuss this from the Free Karen Reed side. And that's so Mike Crawford got the message. Mike Crawford got that message. And he never once asked a question again about the conspiracy theory again. In fact, he deleted that video and he went 100% on board with the grifting again. He's never looked back. So that's cowardly, man. And some people could say you shouldn't say that to another content creator. No, you are a profile in cowardice, and the other side knows it. They know you back down under Turtle Boy's threat. So both sides understand this. And the Glairer obviously understands it too. So it is what it is. He knows it. And then he pulled this stunt a few weeks ago too. Mike Crawford apparently decided to do a show on me and claims that he sent an invitation for me to go on the show to answer to it. I had no idea about it. I never got the invitation. I had no idea he was doing a show on me. I didn't see it, was unaware of it. Until about 2 days later, Kate on her channel showed the video, a little bit of it, and did like a reaction to it. And so I was watching Kate's channel, and watching Kate's channel, I saw him say on his show, well, I invited Yellow Cottage Tales on my channel, but he's a coward, so he wouldn't come on. It's unbelievable. Remember when he sent that Facebook friend request to me almost a year ago before that show, we did communicate after that. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't friendly communication, but that has not been closed. He can still message me on Facebook, and he knows it. He could have sent me a private message on Twitter. He knows that. If he actually did leave a message somewhere, he chose to leave it knowing that I wouldn't see it. And I didn't see it. But then he calls me a coward for not going on his show. But then when I did learn about the message 2 days later from Kate's channel, I sent him a message. And I said, I accept anytime you want me on your show. Now, I had asked to go on his show on other times too. And what did he say? He said, nope, it's too late. You had your chance. And then he blocked me. So, dude, that is a coward. You can't even become a more perfect profile of a coward than those actions portray him as. So he knows, and they know it too. Both sides know it. That guy has to get up every morning and look in the mirror and say, God, I'm a coward. It must suck. It must suck. I did go over it, Joe. There was the only thing, so we don't have any details about what's in the new documents that are filed. There was just a listing that new evidence has been entered into discovery. And the first three of them were about, apparently about Chloe. So what it looks like based on looking at that and looking at the questioning, the defense line of questioning to Dr. Russell, apparently the state police went up to where Chloe lives in Vermont and got a dental impression. So this is why the defense was going down that line. So that's the stuff that was sent in there into discovery, presumably. I don't know. And then The fourth item was something from Jessica Hyde. That was now Jessica Hyde was the independent expert, one of two, that talked about things like the 220. She's a forensic data expert, and she's one of the best in the world. But I don't know what new she has put in there. Presumably it's something new about how maybe Celebrite has adjusted this. No, Chloe is not. Jay, dude, I'm going to throw you out soon, Jay, because you're saying stupid shit, and that's disinformation. Chloe is not dead. All right? I don't mind the good questions, but stupidity triggers me just the way going in reverse at 24 miles an hour will trigger an event in text stream. Because that's just dumb, man. There's no reason to be saying shit like that. Chloe's not dead. We want you to be here and be a gadfly a little bit, but Jesus. Get Chloe on the show, yeah. That would be good. Heisenberg says they say no evidence on Karen, and within the same breath, they scream framed as well. No sense of critical thinking among them. No, critical thinking is not their strength. Yeah, exactly. And you know, Mike Crawford, one of the last clips I did see from him was maybe a month or so ago after Karen Reed had done maybe Dateline. And Crawford had advice for Karen, which he made public. And he said, look, don't stop doing these shows like this where you can't control the edits. Go on shows only that are friendly to you that you can control, like me. So he basically said, he just admitted that I'm not actually covering this objectively. I am just a mouthpiece for Karen Reed. He said the quiet part out loud in that post. He's not very smart, so he doesn't realize that that's what he said, but that's what he said. So what are you guys all doing for Christmas? Been almost 3 hours, so I'll have to get off soon. Elaine says, I'm curious about dental impressions due to the junk science. I don't know if those dental impressions will tell us anything. And actually, Dr. Russell was trying to prepare for that by explaining at the Dauber hearing recently that civilian dogs, as opposed to police dogs, are trained to bite and hold. So you'll get more likely to get a good dental impression. She was trying to explain that you don't get that from a civilian dog. I couldn't tell you. Zigzag says they show a lot. I have no idea. Yeah, Arcus did not say that he was not struck by a vehicle. It's clear the ARCA guys didn't think it was likely that John was struck by a vehicle, but they did not say it was impossible. They never said that. In their testimony was also weird too. They seemed to only consider the idea that John was standing with his arm like this, which is, why would he? Why would anybody be standing like that? You know, unless you're doing the Nazi salute or something. No, I mean, whatever position he was in, he seems to have, you put up your arm defensively and your arm is bent and it hits your elbow. So, but for some reason, they didn't even consider that. And instead, they were building cannons to shoot cocktail glasses at the taillight, which is just weird. It didn't seem, for as smart as those guys are, it didn't seem like a very rigorous effort to get to the truth. So, but Zigzag, are they? She says she's a healthcare investigator and have worked in many dental cases. But does this apply with dogs and civilian dogs that would do an attack like that? I'm not saying it doesn't. I have no idea. Yeah, there was no canine DNA found on the clothing. Doesn't seem impossible. From what I've seen, the shreds on the clothing and the wounds on the arms seem to match up pretty well with the injuries that would be caused by the housing underneath where the plastic came off. But injuries in a high-speed accident, or this is what I was told very early on at this case, talking to other police officers who, route cops and stuff like that, who came across a lot of scenes like this, and they said the injuries are really, really different, are really difficult for civilians or ordinary police to understand what happened, but the people that are trained on it would. The case cycles have been cleaned up. I guess you could ask yourself this about all right. So let's finish with this when it comes to dental impressions. If the dental impression that the state police presumably got from Chloe matched up to the wounds on John's arm, then that's it, right? Karen walks. Right? But if they don't match up, then the defense is just going to say, well, Chloe didn't get enough of a grip to leave a bite, to leave a readable impression on the arm, right? So the prosecution really had to be sure that John was not attacked by a dog if they wanted to risk going up to Vermont to get those dental impressions. Because those impressions, to my amateur way of thinking about it, had a lot more potential to help the defendant than they did to hurt her, in the sense that I don't know how you're going to be able to show. It's harder to prove the negative. How are you going to prove that those injuries weren't caused by a dog if the dog attack, just for example, didn't leave very good impressions on the arm? And that's what they'll always say. So I think the fact that they did that is really just another sign how confident they are of what happened. Yeah, King of Kings says they never refuted a side swipe with John hitting his head on the ground. And that's true. I think, but the problem was caused by Trooper Paul's explanation, which seemed to have John spinning like a top. That was a problem. Again, that was probably more of an issue of articulation. I think what he maybe meant was that he maybe spun once or something like that, or spun a half. I don't know. We don't know what he meant. It wasn't very clear. And so we got to get a better explanation for the next trial. B Chance says, I don't think they're getting Chloe's dental. I think they're showing licensing. Maybe, but what would that? I don't know what that would do, but okay. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much. Today is the 21st. We'll see if I have time to do another quick show before Christmas or maybe on Christmas. But if I don't see you guys all, please have a very good Christmas. Merry Christmas. Have a good holidays. We'll definitely see you before the new year. And thank you very much for Louis Sassel. Big fan, Kev. Thanks for the coverage. So thank you very much for Joe and Thomas Fleming. As always, Merry Christmas to everybody. And may the Grinch stay away from your house.